Welcome, fellow wanderer, to a journey through the life of a legend. Tonight, we follow the path of Geralt of Rivia, the White Wolf, whose story spans decades of monster hunts, impossible choices, and the slow discovery that destiny cannot be outrun. This is a tale of mutations and magic, of love found and lost, and of a man who thought himself incapable of learning what it truly means to be human. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we walk together through the long and winding road of the Witcher's life. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let us begin. Our story begins not with the famous White Wolf of legend, but with a young boy whose name has been lost to time and memory. In the harsh mountains of Kaedwen, in a place where winter seems eternal and hope grows as scarce as wildflowers in snow, there once stood a fortress called Kaer Morhen. The School of the Wolf, they called it, though few who spoke that name understood the true weight of what happened within those ancient stone walls. The boy who would become Geralt arrived at this fortress, as so many others did, brought by circumstance, desperation, or the cruel mathematics of survival that governed the medieval world. Perhaps his parents could not feed another mouth. Perhaps they believed the stories of glory that sometimes surrounded the Witcher schools. Perhaps they simply had no choice in a world where choice was a luxury few could afford. What we know is that this nameless child, no more than 7 or 8 years old, climbed the winding path to Kaer Morhen's gates and crossed the threshold into a world that would strip away everything he had been and forge him into something entirely new. The process of creating a Witcher was not one undertaken lightly, nor was it one that many survived. Vesemir, the oldest of the School of the Wolf, would become the closest thing to a father that Geralt would ever know. Ancient even then, with eyes that had seen centuries of boys arrive full of hope or terror and emerge as something between man and monster, Vesemir understood the weight of what they were asking of these children. The mutations that created Witchers were a process developed through trial and error, through the sacrifice of countless young lives on the altar of necessity. The world needed monster hunters, you see. In those days, the continent was overrun with creatures that emerged from the dark places between worlds. The conjunction of the spheres, that cataclysmic event that had brought humans, elves, and monsters together on one plane of existence, had left behind a world where nightmares walked freely through the forests and mountains. Villages would be destroyed overnight by griffins or drowners. Entire trade routes would become impassable due to neckers or ghouls. The natural order had been shattered, and someone had to stand between the darkness and the flickering lights of human civilization. But creating those guardians required a price that few were willing to pay, and fewer still were able to survive. The Trial of the Grasses was the first and most brutal of the mutations. For days, the boy who would become Geralt was fed a mixture of mutagenic herbs and alchemical compounds that would either adapt his body to superhuman capabilities or kill him in agony. His hair turned white from the shock of the transformation. His eyes became those of a predator, pupils that could dilate to catch the faintest starlight, irises that gleamed with an unnatural amber glow. The mortality rate was staggering. Only 3 in 10 boys survived the Trial of the Grasses, and those who did were forever changed. They gained enhanced strength, speed, and reflexes. Their senses became supernaturally acute, able to track a creature for miles by scent alone or hear a heartbeat from across a crowded room. They became immune to most diseases and toxins, their blood itself becoming poisonous to many of the creatures they would hunt. But they paid for these gifts with their humanity, or so the world believed. The mutations affected more than just their bodies. Most Witchers became sterile, unable to father children or continue bloodlines. Their emotions were believed to be dulled, though this was more myth than reality. The training was designed to suppress sentiment, to create killers who could face horrors that would drive ordinary men mad without hesitation or mercy. They learned to view the world through the cold lens of professional necessity, where every problem could be solved with the right blade and the correct application of violence. But perhaps most crucially, they learned that they would never belong to the world they protected. Witches were mutants, aberrations created by desperate times for desperate purposes. The common people who hired them feared them almost as much as they feared the monsters. Children would hide when a witcher came to town. Women would make protective gestures and whisper prayers. Men would pay their fees quickly and send them on their way with all the warmth they might show a plague bearer. The young Geralt learned these lessons through years of brutal training. He learned the properties of every oil and potion that could give him an edge against his prey. He studied the anatomy and behavioral patterns of creatures most people knew only from nightmares. He mastered the Witcher signs, simple magical gestures that could produce flames, protective barriers, or controlling influences over weak minds. Most importantly, he learned the swordsmanship that would become his signature, the flowing, acrobatic style that turned combat into a deadly dance. Kaer Morhen became his world during those formative years. The other boys training alongside him became his brothers in all but blood. They shared the pain of the mutations, the exhaustion of endless drilling, and the slowly dawning realization that they were being transformed into something that the world needed but would never love. Some of them would not survive the training. Others would graduate and disappear onto the path, the endless road of contracts and hunts that defined a witcher's life, never to be seen again. The School of the Wolf had its own philosophy, its own approach to the witcher's craft. Where other schools might emphasize specific techniques or specialized prey, the Wolf School taught adaptability above all else. A Wolf School witcher learned to assess each situation on its own merits, to find the most efficient solution rather than the most glorious one. They were taught that survival mattered more than honor, that a living witcher could protect more innocent lives than a dead hero. This philosophy would shape everything about Geralt's approach to his profession. He learned to negotiate carefully with clients, to ask probing questions about the true nature of a problem before accepting a contract. Too many young witchers died because they took rumors and hearsay at face value, charging into situations they didn't understand with nothing but courage and steel to guide them. The older witchers had learned to be more cautious, more analytical in their approach. As Geralt progressed through his training, his instructors began to recognize something special in him. He displayed an unusual capacity for the moral complexities that defined a witcher's existence. Where other students might see only monsters to be slain or coin to be earned, Geralt showed an uncanny ability to perceive the deeper currents of any situation. He understood that the line between monster and victim was often thinner than people wanted to believe. This sensitivity would serve him well in the years to come, but it also marked him as different from his brothers. Most witchers learned to suppress their natural empathy as a survival mechanism. The world was harsh enough without taking on the emotional weight of every tragedy they encountered. But Geralt never quite mastered that particular lesson. Throughout his long life, he would continue to care more than was wise, to involve himself in situations that a sensible witcher would avoid, to risk his life for principles that brought him no material reward. His final trials came as he reached young adulthood. The trial of the dreams tested not just his physical capabilities, but his mental fortitude. For days, he was subjected to visions and hallucinations designed to break his spirit or reveal fatal weaknesses in his character. He saw his own death 1,000 different ways. He relived his abandonment as a child, faced manifestations of his deepest fears and doubts. Many candidates broke during this trial, their minds shattered by the psychological assault. But Geralt endured. He emerged from the trial of dreams scarred but unbroken, ready to take his first steps on the path. Vesemir presented him with his silver sword, the weapon that would become as much a part of him as his own arm. Silver for monsters, steel for men, as the saying went. both would serve him well in the years ahead. The day came when he would leave Kaer Morhen for the first time as a full Witcher. He had spent more than a decade within those walls, transformed from a frightened child into something that was no longer entirely human. The mutations had given him capabilities that ordinary men could barely comprehend. But they had also set him apart from humanity in ways that would shape every relationship he would ever form. As he rode down the mountain path on his first hunt, Geralt carried with him all the lessons of the Wolf School. He had been trained to be efficient, analytical, and above all, professional. He would take contracts, complete them successfully, collect his payment, and move on to the next job. The path stretched ahead of him, an endless succession of monsters and clients, of villages grateful for his services, but eager to see him leave. What he could not have known, as he began that first journey into the wider world, was that his story would become so much more than just another witcher's tale of hunt and kill, and payment received. The boy who had arrived at Kaer Morhen nameless and powerless would become a legend, but not for the reasons he had been trained to expect. His greatest battles would not be against the monsters he had been taught to hunt, but against the more complex beasts of prejudice, destiny, and his own reluctant heart. The mutations had taken much from him, but they had not taken everything. Deep within the professional killer they had created, there remained a spark of something that refused to be extinguished. Call it humanity, call it compassion, call it simply the stubborn refusal to accept that the world had to be as cruel and grey as it appeared. That spark would lead him into more trouble than a sensible witcher should ever face. But it would also guide him toward connections and loves that would transform him in ways that no trial or mutation ever could. The White Wolf was born in those mountain halls, forged in pain and tempered by discipline. But Geralt of Rivia, the man who would learn that even witches could find family, that even mutants could love and be loved in return, that even destiny could be challenged and sometimes defeated. That man was still waiting to be discovered somewhere down the long and winding path that stretched ahead. The road to Blaviken stretched before Geralt like a dusty ribbon through the late summer heat. And as he guided Roach down the familiar merchant's track, he could not have known that he was riding toward the moment that would define the rest of his long life. The contract seemed simple enough, the kind of routine monster hunt that had become his bread and butter in the years since leaving Kaer Morhen. A kikimura in the nearby swamps, terrorizing the local farmers and making travel unsafe for anyone foolish enough to venture out after dark. It was exactly the sort of problem that a competent witcher could solve in an afternoon, collect his payment, and move on without complication. But destiny, that cruel and patient force that Geralt would spend decades trying to deny, had already set its pieces in motion. The Kikimura was merely the excuse that drew him to Blaviken. The real reason he was meant to be there had nothing to do with swamp monsters or farmers' complaints. It had to do with a princess whose story had become legend, whose very existence challenged everything the world thought it understood about good and evil, monsters and men. The hunt itself proved routine enough. Kikimuras were cunning predators, but they followed predictable patterns once you understood their nature. Geralt tracked the creature through the fetid waters and tangled roots of the swampland, noting the territorial markings and feeding signs that told him exactly what kind of opponent he faced. The battle, when it came, was over quickly. A few precise strikes with his silver blade, careful positioning to avoid the creature's venomous spines, and another contract was complete. The Kikimura's death throes sent ripples across the dark water, and then silence returned to the swamp. It was with the creature's severed head as proof of his success that Geralt rode into Blaviken, seeking the alderman who had commissioned the hunt. The town was larger than most of the settlements he visited, prosperous enough to afford decent roads and well-maintained buildings. Merchants' wagons moved through the streets with comfortable frequency, and the people seemed well-fed and content. It should have been a pleasant enough place to conduct business, and perhaps spend a night in a proper bed before moving on to the next contract. But even as he tied Roach at the hitching post outside the local tavern, Geralt sensed that something was not quite right in Blaviken. There was a tension in the air, a quality of watchful waiting that spoke of secrets and unresolved conflicts. People glanced at him with more than the usual mixture of fear and curiosity that followed witches. Their eyes held something else, something that suggested they were expecting trouble and wondering whether he might be part of it. The tavern should have been a refuge from such concerns. These establishments were among the few places where a witcher could expect something approaching normal treatment. The patrons might keep their distance, but they were usually too interested in their own drinks and conversations to pay him much attention. So when a woman approached his table with a tankard of ale and a smile that seemed genuinely welcoming, Geralt found himself both pleased and suspicious. She was beautiful, there was no denying that. Her dark hair caught the lamplight, and her eyes held an intelligence that spoke of education and breeding far above what one might expect in a tavern-serving girl. When she spoke, her voice carried the refined accent of nobility, though she wore the simple dress of a common woman. Everything about her suggested mysteries, and mysteries, as Geralt had learned through hard experience, were usually more dangerous than any monster he might face in honest combat. "You must be the Witcher," she said, settling into the chair across from him without invitation. "I'm Renfri. I've been waiting for you." The name should have meant nothing to him, but something in the way she said it, something in the careful way she watched his reaction, told Geralt that this woman was far more than she appeared. He had learned to trust his instincts in such matters, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that Renfri represented a complication he would do well to avoid. But she was pleasant company, and it had been too long since he had enjoyed conversation with someone who did not immediately flinch away from his yellow eyes or make protective gestures against evil. They talked of small things at first, the weather and the roads, the quality of the local ale, and the prospects for the harvest. She asked intelligent questions about his profession, displaying none of the morbid curiosity or obvious fear that usually characterize such inquiries. It was only when a young girl approached their table that Geralt began to understand the true nature of his situation. Marilka, as she introduced herself, was the daughter of the local alderman, the very man Geralt had come to see about his payment. She was perhaps 15 or 16, with the kind of fresh-faced innocence that reminded him uncomfortably of his own lost childhood. But when she looked at Renfri, her expression grew troubled, and Geralt noticed how quickly she completed her errand and departed. Following Marilka's directions, Geralt made his way to the tower that dominated Blaviken's skyline. It was an ancient structure, older than the town itself, built in the days when mages wielded power openly and without apology. The current occupant, he learned, was a sorcerer who called himself Master Irian, though Geralt's enhanced senses detected the subtle signs that suggested this was not his true name. Stregobor, as he would eventually reveal himself, was a man haunted by fears both rational and otherwise. Age had bent his frame and whitened his hair, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him a power in the magical community. When he spoke of his reasons for summoning Geralt to Blaviken, his voice carried the weight of genuine terror. The curse of the Black Sun, he explained, was no mere superstition. 60 girls, born under the eclipse that marked the demon goddess Lilith's return, would prepare the way for humanity's extinction. They would fill the river valleys with blood, and from that carnage would rise an evil that would consume the world. It was a prophecy that combined the worst fears of an age that had already seen too much darkness. Stregobor had made it his life's work to study these cursed girls, to understand the nature of their mutation and find some way to prevent the prophecy's fulfillment. His methods, as he described them, had been thorough and ruthless. He had locked the girls away in towers, supposedly for their own protection and that of others. He had subjected them to treatments and examinations designed to cure or at least contain their dangerous nature. But each girl had died under his care, and rather than seeing this as evidence of the cruelty of his methods, Stregobor interpreted their deaths as proof of the curse's power. The mutations he claimed to have found in their bodies, the internal changes that set them apart from normal humans, became in his mind justification for any action taken against them. He had convinced himself that eliminating these girls was not murder but a necessary evil, the lesser of two catastrophic choices. Renfri was the most dangerous of them all, in Stregobor's telling. Princess of Craden, daughter of Queen Aridea, she had been born at the exact moment of the eclipse. Her mother had died giving birth to her, supposedly killed by the very evil that now lived within her daughter. The baby had been delivered into a world already darkened by her presence, and from that moment on, she had been marked for death. The story Stregobor told was one of escalating horror. As Renfri grew, she had supposedly displayed the savage nature that the curse had instilled in her. She killed small animals for pleasure, showed no capacity for normal human emotion, and gradually revealed the monstrous intelligence that would make her such a threat. When Stregobor's agents had finally come for her, they had found evidence of her true nature, proof that she was already becoming the destroyer that prophecy claimed she would be. But Renfri had not died as easily as the other cursed girls. Her mutations made her resistant to magic, and her cunning allowed her to escape before Stregobor could complete his work. She had vanished into the wilderness, and for years there had been no word of her fate. Stregobor had almost begun to hope that she had perished on her own, claimed by the harsh world that showed little mercy to those without protection or resources. Then the reports had begun to reach him. A woman matching Renfri's description, leading a band of cutthroats and murderers across the northern kingdoms. Villages burned, travelers robbed and killed, entire merchant caravans disappearing without trace. The death toll attributed to her band grew with each telling, and Stregobor became convinced that the curse was finally manifesting its true power. Now she had come to Blaviken, tracking him down at last. Her men were positioned throughout the town, waiting for his signal to begin the slaughter that would prove her nature once and for all. Only Geralt stood between Stregobor and the death that the princess had promised him. Only a witch's blade could end the threat that magic could not touch. As Stregobor made his case, Geralt found himself caught between skepticism and duty. The sorcerer's fear seemed genuine enough, and his knowledge of the magical forces involved was clearly extensive. But something about the story felt wrong, incomplete in ways that suggested important details had been omitted or distorted. The professional caution that had kept Geralt alive through years of dangerous contracts was warning him that this situation was far more complex than it appeared. Moreover, there was the question of Renfri herself. The woman he had met in the tavern bore little resemblance to the monster that Stregobor described. She had shown no signs of madness or supernatural malevolence. If anything, she had seemed more human, more genuinely alive, than many of the supposedly normal people he encountered in his travels. Could someone hide such essential evil so completely, or was Stregobor's interpretation of events colored by his own fears and prejudices? The moral complexity of the situation was exactly the kind of problem that Geralt's training had not adequately prepared him for. The School of the Wolf had taught him to hunt monsters, not to serve as judge and executioner in disputes between humans. His silver sword was meant for creatures whose nature was unambiguously evil, not for people whose crimes might be matters of interpretation or circumstance. But Stregobor was offering substantial payment for Renfri's death, and Geralt's funds were running low. The life of a witcher was expensive, requiring constant maintenance of weapons and armor, regular supplies of the oils and potions that gave him his edge in combat, and of course the basic necessities of food and shelter. A contract like this could keep him comfortable for months, allowing him to be more selective in choosing future work. Yet when Stregobor finished his lengthy explanation and made his formal offer, Geralt found himself declining. Perhaps it was professional pride, the Witcher's traditional restriction to hunting actual monsters rather than involving himself in human politics. Perhaps it was simple caution, an unwillingness to commit himself to a course of action when he did not fully understand the situation. Or perhaps it was something deeper, an instinct that told him Renfri deserved to tell her own version of events before he made any irreversible decisions. Whatever his reasons, Geralt left Stregobor's tower without accepting the contract. The sorcerer's anger and disappointment were palpable, but Geralt had learned long ago that he could not live his life according to other people's expectations. The path was his to walk, and he would choose his own steps along it. But destiny, it seemed, was not prepared to let him walk away from Blaviken's troubles so easily. As he made his way back through the town streets, Geralt found himself confronted by the very woman whose death Stregobor had requested. Renfri stepped out of the shadows near the town's edge, her hand resting casually on the hilt of her sword. Her expression unreadable, the conversation that followed would haunt Geralt for the rest of his very long life. Renfri's version of events was very different from Stregobor's, and far more believable in its details. She spoke of a childhood destroyed by the sorcerer's obsession, of being taken from her family and subjected to procedures that would have broken a weaker spirit. The mutations that Stregobor claimed were evidence of her evil nature, she described as the results of his own experiments. Attempts to prove his theories through torture disguised as medical examination. The band of killers that supposedly followed her. 7 men, she admitted, but they were not the bloodthirsty monsters that Stregobor had described. They were survivors like herself, people who had been cast out by a world that feared what it did not understand. They took what they needed to live, and yes, sometimes that meant violence. But they were not the apocalyptic force that the sorcerer's paranoia had painted them as. As she spoke, Geralt found himself studying her more carefully. His enhanced senses could detect no trace of the supernatural evil that Stregobor insisted dwelt within her. Her heartbeat was steady, her scent carried none of the wrongness that characterized truly unnatural beings. If she was a monster, she was unlike any he had ever encountered. But there was something else about her, something that his training had not prepared him to recognize. When she looked at him, when she spoke of destiny and the choices that shaped their lives, Geralt felt a connection that transcended the merely physical. Here was someone who understood the isolation that came with being different, the weight of expectations and fears that others placed upon you, the difficulty of finding your place in a world that seemed determined to reject you. They walked together beyond Blaviken's walls, following paths that led into the forest where Geralt had made his temporary camp. The conversation continued, meandering through topics that seemed to have little connection to the immediate crisis, but somehow felt essential to understanding each other. Renfri spoke of the dreams that had guided her steps, visions of a future that seemed to center around the Witcher she had only just met. When she told him of the prophecy that surrounded his own life, the girl in the woods who would be his destiny, Geralt felt the familiar chill of unwanted revelation. He had spent years trying to avoid the snares of fate, the predetermined paths that others seemed so eager to assign to him. The idea that his future had already been written, that his choices were illusions, and his freedom, an elaborate deception, was more terrifying to him than any monster he might face in honest combat. But Renfri's words carried a weight that he could not easily dismiss. She spoke with the authority of someone who had seen beyond the veil of ordinary existence, who understood the hidden patterns that connected all lives. When she touched him, when their conversation turned to more intimate matters, Geralt found himself questioning all the assumptions he had made about his own nature and capabilities. The night they spent together was unlike anything in his previous experience. Not merely the physical joining, though that was intense enough to surprise them both, but the deeper connection that seemed to transcend the boundaries between separate people. For a few precious hours, Geralt felt truly understood, truly accepted for what he was, rather than feared for what he might represent. It was in the vulnerable moment after their passion had spent itself that Renfri spoke most clearly about what lay ahead. The dreams that had brought her to Blaviken, the visions that showed her a future written in blood and sorrow. She saw her own death, and Geralt's hand delivering it. She saw the hatred that would follow him afterward, the stones that would drive him from Blaviken like a rabid dog. And she saw the child who would change everything, the girl whose destiny was so tightly woven with his own that neither could escape it. When Geralt woke the following morning, he was alone in the forest camp. Roach nickered softly, sensing his distress, but could offer no comfort for the growing dread that filled his chest. The connection he had felt with Renfri the night before now seemed like a cruel joke, a moment of false hope before the inevitable tragedy that destiny had planned for them both. He knew, with the certainty that came from years of reading the subtle signs that preceded violence, that Renfri had not simply departed. She had gone back into Blaviken with a purpose that would force his hand, that would make the choice he had been trying to avoid. The game that had begun with Stregobor's summons was entering its final phase, and Geralt was no longer a spectator but an unwilling participant. The ride back into town felt like a funeral procession. With each step that brought him closer to Blaviken's center, Geralt could feel the weight of approaching disaster. His enhanced hearing picked up the sounds of combat before he could see the source, the ring of steel on steel that told him the violence had already begun. Renfri's men had indeed come to Blaviken, but not as the conquering army that Stregobor had feared. They were few in number, desperate rather than confident, driven by loyalty to their leader rather than bloodlust or greed. The townspeople who had tried to stop them lay wounded or dead in the streets, their blood soaking into the dust in patterns that seemed to mock the prophecies that had brought them all to this moment. The confrontation in the marketplace was brief but decisive. Geralt's training took over, the years of practice and discipline transforming him into a weapon more precise and deadly than any blade. One by one, Renfri's followers fell to his sword, their own skills no match for a witcher's enhanced capabilities. He felt no pleasure in their deaths, only the grim satisfaction of necessity fulfilled. But it was the final duel, the moment when he faced Renfri herself, that would echo through his nightmares for decades to come. She fought with the desperation of someone who knew the outcome but refused to accept it, her blade seeking his heart with a fury born of betrayal and lost hope. For a few terrifying seconds, Geralt thought she might actually succeed, that her human determination might overcome his superhuman abilities. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. A stumble, a moment's overextension, and Geralt's blade found the gap in her defense. Her own dagger, turned against her in that final instant, opened her throat and sent her lifeblood spilling onto the cobblestones. As she died in his arms, Renfri's last words were not curses or pleas, but a repetition of the prophecy that had brought them together. The girl in the woods would be with him always, she whispered, and he would learn too late what he had lost in Blaviken. Stregobor's arrival to examine the aftermath felt like a violation of something sacred. The sorcerer's satisfaction at Renfri's death, his eager plans to dissect her body in search of proof for his theories, transformed Geralt's grief into rage. When the townspeople began to gather, when they saw the bodies scattered through their marketplace and demanded an explanation, Stregobor was quick to shift blame onto the witcher who had done his killing for him. The stones came as Renfri had foretold, thrown by hands that had welcomed him as a savior only hours before. The titles they shouted as they drove him from their town would follow him for the rest of his life. Butcher of Blaviken, monster, killer of innocence. The man who had tried to choose the lesser evil and found that evil was not a matter of degrees, but of perspective. As Geralt rode away from Blaviken for the last time, leaving Renfri's body to Stregobor's cold curiosity and the townspeople's uncertain fear, he carried with him lessons that would shape everything that followed. He had learned that destiny could not be avoided through inaction, that moral choices were rarely as clear as they appeared, and that the price of doing what seemed right could be higher than anyone should be asked to pay. But perhaps most importantly, he had learned that he was not the emotionless killing machine that his mutation was supposed to have created. The grief he felt for Renfri, the rage at the injustice of her fate, the lingering doubt about whether he had made the right choice, all of these proved that something essentially human remained within him. The trials and training had changed his body and sharpened his skills, but they had not succeeded in killing his heart. The path stretched ahead of him once again, longer and lonelier now than it had seemed before. But somewhere in the future that Renfri's visions had revealed, there waited a girl in the woods who would change everything. A child whose destiny was bound to his by threads stronger than choice or circumstance. The woman who had died calling him monster had also promised him redemption. And Geralt would spend the next decades learning whether that promise was hope or merely another cruel deception. The months that followed Geralt's exile from Blaviken passed like a fever dream of mud-splattered roads and Fonaflier, thankless contracts. The title that had been branded upon him, Butcher of Blaviken, seemed to travel faster than he did, reaching taverns and market squares days before his arrival. Where once innkeepers might have greeted a witcher with cautious respect, now they offered grudging service and watchful eyes. The stories grew in the telling, as stories always do, until Geralt found himself credited with massacres he had never committed and cruelties that existed only in the fearful imagination of those who had never met him. It was in this state of professional and personal isolation that destiny, with its characteristic sense of irony, chose to introduce him to the one person who would spend the next several decades determinedly reshaping his reputation from monster to hero. The meeting took place in a tavern whose name Geralt would later forget, in a town that differed from a dozen others only in the particular shade of suspicion with which its inhabitants regarded him. The bard who approached his table that evening was everything that Geralt was not. Where the witcher was quiet and solitary, this stranger radiated the kind of confident charisma that drew attention like iron filings to a lodestone. His clothes were well made but travel-worn, cut in the latest fashion but adapted for practicality. His lute was clearly an instrument of quality, its wood burnished to a warm glow that spoke of careful maintenance and frequent use. Most striking of all was his apparent complete lack of fear. Where other tavern patrons gave Geralt's table a wide berth, this young man slid into the opposite chair with the casual ease of someone settling down with an old friend. His smile was warm and genuine, unmarred by the nervous tics or defensive postures that typically characterized Geralt's interactions with strangers. "That song you're humming," the bard said without preamble, his voice carrying the cultured accent of someone who had received a proper education. "It's all wrong, you know. Completely inaccurate on several key points of monster physiology. The creature you're singing about doesn't even exist." It was not the opening that Geralt had expected, and perhaps that was precisely the point. Rather than the usual queries about his profession or nervous attempts at small talk, here was someone engaging with him as if he were simply another traveler with interesting stories to tell. The novelty of it was almost refreshing. "Jaskia," the bard continued, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed to assume acceptance rather than request it. "And you're clearly a witcher, though I have to say you don't look nearly as monstrous as the songs would have people believe. Yellow eyes, yes, but rather striking ones actually. And your hair is certainly white enough, though it's more silver than the snow white that the balladeers usually describe." There was something about Jaskia's manner that made it impossible to take offense at his observations. He spoke with the easy confidence of someone who had never learned to fear the world or the people in it, and his interest in Geralt seemed genuinely academic rather than morbidly curious. When he launched into a critique of contemporary ballad writing and the deplorable tendency of bards to prioritize rhyme scheme over factual accuracy, Geralt found himself actually listening rather than simply enduring the conversation until he could politely escape. The turning point came when Jaskia, having thoroughly dissected the failings of his fellow musicians, leaned forward with the kind of intense focus that suggested a man seized by inspiration. "You know what you need," he said, his eyes bright with sudden possibility. "You need better publicity. Someone to tell your story properly. To show people what you actually do rather than feeding them these ridiculous tales about bloodthirsty monsters masquerading as heroes." It was a proposition that struck Geralt as both absurd and vaguely insulting. He had never sought fame or recognition, had been trained from childhood to expect nothing but suspicion and grudging tolerance from the world he protected. The idea that he needed some flamboyant troubadour to improve his image seemed to miss the entire point of what it meant to be a witcher. They were not heroes in the traditional sense, not knights seeking glory or recognition. They were professionals, craftsmen who happened to work with silver swords and monster guts instead of wood or iron. But something about Jaskia's enthusiasm was infectious, and when the bard offered to accompany him to his next contract to observe a real witcher at work, Geralt found himself agreeing. Perhaps it was loneliness, the cumulative weight of too many solitary meals and conversations limited to negotiations over payment and monster behavior. Perhaps it was curiosity about how someone so thoroughly unsuited for the dangers of the path would handle his first exposure to its realities. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that Jaskia's company, however impractical, was more pleasant than the alternative of traveling alone with only his increasingly dark thoughts for companionship. The contract that awaited them in the next town over was exactly the sort of problem that Geralt had been handling for years without particular difficulty or fanfare. Local farmers had been losing livestock to something they called a devil, a creature that struck at night and left behind only scattered bones and traces of sulfur. The description was vague enough to encompass several different types of monsters, but the sulfur suggested something from the cursed or relict family rather than a simple predator. As they rode toward the mountains where the creature supposedly made its lair, Jaskia kept up a steady stream of commentary that ranged from observations about the local flora to questions about witcher training to suggestions for how Geralt might improve his public image. Most of his ideas were thoroughly impractical, involving grand gestures and dramatic speeches that would have made any self-respecting witcher cringe. But beneath the bard's apparent frivolity lay a sharp intelligence and a genuine desire to understand both the man he was traveling with and the world they moved through. The truth about their supposed devil revealed itself quickly enough once Geralt began tracking it properly. The creature was indeed a relict, but not the malevolent demon that the farmers' stories had painted. Torque, as they would learn to call him, was a sylvan, one of the forest spirits that had once been common throughout the northern kingdoms, but had been driven into hiding by human expansion and suspicion. The encounter that followed was Geralt's first real lesson in the complexities of Jaskia's character. When the sylvan charged, when hooves and horns presented an immediate threat to life and limb, the bard did not flee or cower, as Geralt might have expected. Instead, he watched with the fascination of a natural philosopher observing a particularly interesting specimen, taking mental notes that would later emerge in surprisingly accurate verses about the grace and power of creatures most people knew only from nightmares. But it was Geralt's decision to spare the Sylvan's life, to find a solution that did not require bloodshed, that truly captured Jaskia's imagination. The Witcher who wrestled Torque to the ground only to release him with a warning rather than a death blow was not the monster that popular imagination had created. Here was someone who chose mercy when violence would have been easier, who sought understanding rather than simply imposing his will through superior force. The abduction that followed, when elven arrows dropped them both into unconsciousness, provided Jaskier with an even more complex view of the world beyond human settlements. The elves who held them captive were not the graceful, ethereal beings of romantic ballads, but desperate refugees driven from their homes by human expansion and forced to survive through theft and hiding. Their leader, Filavandrel, carried the weight of a people's displacement, the knowledge that his choices might determine whether his followers lived to see another generation. In the dank cave where they found themselves bound back to back, surrounded by elves whose arrows could end their lives in an instant, Jaskier witnessed something that would change his understanding of heroism forever. Rather than attempting to escape or fight his way free, Geralt chose to listen. He asked questions about the elves' situation, sought to understand the forces that had driven them to desperate measures. When he spoke, it was not with the authority of someone imposing judgment, but with the careful attention of someone trying to find a solution that might serve everyone's needs. The story that emerged was one of systematic displacement and casual cruelty. The great cleansing that Filavandrel spoke of had not been a single catastrophic event, but a long process of marginalization that had slowly pushed the elves from their ancestral lands. Humans had settled where they pleased, claimed resources that had sustained elven communities for centuries, and responded to any resistance with overwhelming violence, justified by claims of superiority and divine mandate. Torque's thefts, which had seemed like simple banditry to the human farmers, were revealed to be desperate attempts to keep the elven community alive through another harsh winter. The Sylvan had not been acting from malice or greed, but from loyalty to people who had accepted him when the rest of the world had turned away. Even his supposed deal with the devil was nothing more than an arrangement with desperate refugees who needed his help to survive. For Jaskier, whose worldview had been shaped by the comfortable assumptions of human civilization, these revelations were profoundly disturbing. The stories he had grown up with, the songs that celebrated human heroes and their victories over monstrous enemies, suddenly seemed far more complex and morally ambiguous. If the elves were not the enemy, if their actions were driven by necessity rather than malice, then what did that say about the heroes who had driven them into hiding? Geralt's response to this moral complexity was characteristically practical. Rather than becoming paralyzed by the competing claims of justice and survival, he sought a solution that might address everyone's immediate needs. The gold he had been paid for killing the supposed devil could be given to the elves, providing them with resources to relocate somewhere beyond human territories. It was not a perfect solution, and it certainly was not justice for the wrongs that had been done to them, but it was a gesture that acknowledged their humanity and offered them a chance to find a better situation. The parting gift of Filavandrel's race, the crude tune that he hummed as they departed, became the foundation for something entirely new in the tradition of Witcher ballads. Where previous songs had focused on the drama of combat and the exotic nature of the monsters involved, Jaskier's emerging composition would emphasize the moral complexity of the situation and the Witcher's role as someone who sought understanding rather than simply dealing out death. As they made their way down from the Poplexeis mountains, Jaskier experimented with melodies and verses that would capture not just what had happened, but what it meant. The song that eventually emerged from this process would be unlike anything that had been written about witches before. Rather than portraying Geralt as a fearsome killer or a simple monster hunter, it would present him as someone who combined physical prowess with moral intelligence, who chose diplomacy over violence whenever possible. The transformation in how people responded to Geralt was gradual but noticeable. Where the bard's music played, where stories of the encounter with the elves spread, the Witcher found himself greeted with something approaching curiosity rather than fear. Innkeepers who might once have reluctantly provided him with a corner table began offering him rooms. Merchants who had previously avoided him on the road began nodding politely when their paths crossed. But perhaps more importantly for Geralt himself was the companionship that Jaskier provided. The bard's irrepressible enthusiasm and genuine affection created something that the Witcher had not experienced since his days training with his brothers at Kaer Morhen. Here was someone who chose to spend time with him not because they needed his professional services or because they were too frightened to leave, but simply because they enjoyed his company. The friendship that developed between them was unlike anything either had experienced before. Jaskier brought color and music to days that had previously been defined only by the pragmatic necessities of survival and professional obligation. His stories of life in Oxenfurt's academy, his observations about the people and places they encountered, his endless curiosity about the world and everything in it, all served to remind Geralt that there was beauty and wonder to be found even in the harsh realities of life on the path. In return, Geralt provided Jaskier with material for songs unlike any that had been written before. The bard's exposure to the real work of monster hunting, to the moral complexities that defined most of Geralt's contracts, gave him insights that no academic study could have provided. His ballads began to reflect a more nuanced understanding of the world, one that acknowledged the grey areas and difficult choices that characterized life beyond the safety of civilization's centers. Their travels together took them through landscapes both beautiful and dangerous. From the civilized comfort of major trading centers to the wild territories where humanity's hold was tenuous at best. Each contract brought new challenges and new opportunities for Jaskier to observe how Geralt approached problems that had no clear solutions. A haunting that turned out to be a grieving father's guilt manifesting as supernatural phenomena. A supposed vampire that proved to be a lonely widower whose appearance had been altered by a curse. A rampaging monster that was actually protecting its young from human encroachment. In each case, Geralt's approach was the same. Listen first, investigate thoroughly, and seek the solution that caused the least harm to all involved. It was not always possible to find such solutions, and sometimes violence remained the only viable option. But the willingness to look for alternatives, to consider the perspectives of all parties involved, marked him as fundamentally different from the crude monster killer that popular imagination had created. Jaskier's songs began to reflect these complexities, and as they spread throughout the northern kingdoms, they gradually began to change how people thought about witches in general, and Geralt in particular. The Butcher of Blaviken slowly gave way to other epithets, names that emphasized skill and nobility rather than simple brutality. The White Wolf became a figure associated not just with deadly efficiency, but with wisdom and compassion. But perhaps the most significant change was in Geralt himself. The isolation and cynicism that had been building since Blaviken began to ease under the influence of Jaskier's relentless optimism and genuine affection. The Witcher, who had once believed himself incapable of normal human relationships, discovered that friendship was not only possible but necessary. The emotional numbness that he had mistaken for professional detachment began to thaw, revealing depths of feeling that his mutations had suppressed but not eliminated. The partnership that developed between them was symbiotic in the best sense. Jaskier's presence made Geralt more human, more willing to engage with the world beyond the narrow requirements of his profession. In return, Geralt's protection allowed Jaskier to witness and chronicle aspects of the world that would have remained forever hidden from him. Together, they created something that neither could have achieved alone, a new understanding of what it meant to be a hero in a world where heroism was more complex than any ballad could capture. As the seasons passed and their friendship deepened, both men began to understand that they had found something rare and valuable, In a world that often seemed designed to isolate and embitter those who did not fit its narrow definitions of normality, they had discovered the transformative power of acceptance and genuine companionship. The path, which had once been a lonely road leading nowhere in particular, became a shared journey toward understanding both the world they traveled through and their own place within it. The road to Temeria stretched before Geralt and Jaskia like a ribbon of packed earth beneath the autumn sky, and with each mile they traveled, the stories grew darker. Whispers followed them from village to village, tales of something monstrous stalking the night in the kingdom's capital. Miners spoke of missing colleagues who had ventured too close to the old castle. Merchants avoided the upper city entirely, conducting their business in the lower markets before fleeing with the sunset. But it was not these stories that had drawn Geralt northward toward King Foltest's troubled realm. It was the tale of another Witcher, one whose reputation had apparently preceded him into Temeria only to end in disgrace and disappearance. Remus had been his name, and according to the fragmented reports that filtered down through the taverns and trading posts, he had accepted a substantial contract to deal with whatever was terrorizing the capital. 3,000 orens, enough to keep a Witcher comfortable for months, had supposedly changed hands. Then Remus had vanished, and the monster had continued its deadly work. For most Witchers, another's failure would have been cause for caution rather than opportunity. The School of the Wolf had not taught Geralt to compete with his brothers or to profit from their misfortunes, but Remus had been different, a Witcher whose methods and ethics had always been questionable. If he had indeed taken payment and fled rather than facing whatever stalked Temeria's shadows, then someone would need to clean up the mess he had left behind. And if he had tried to complete his contract and failed, then his body deserved better than to lie forgotten in some monster's lair. The journey to Temeria took Geralt and Jaskia through landscapes that grew progressively more unsettled as they approached their destination. Farmsteads stood abandoned, their fields unharvested and their livestock vanished. The few travelers they encountered on the roads moved in armed groups, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line for threats that might emerge from the gathering dusk. Even the weather seemed to reflect the region's unease, with grey clouds that promised rain but delivered only an oppressive, humid heat that left everyone irritable and on edge. Jaskia, whose enthusiasm for adventure had carried him through their previous encounters with monsters and mysteries, began to show signs of genuine nervousness as they drew closer to Temeria's capital. His usual stream of cheerful commentary gradually gave way to periods of thoughtful silence, and Geralt noticed that the bard's hand had developed a habit of drifting toward the small knife he wore at his belt. It was not much of a weapon, hardly adequate for the threats they might face, but the gesture spoke of a growing awareness that their travels had taken them into genuinely dangerous territory. The capital itself, when it finally came into view, was a study in contrasts that immediately caught Geralt's attention. The lower city bustled with normal activity, merchants hawking their wares, and citizens going about their daily business with the kind of determined normalcy that spoke of people refusing to acknowledge an obvious threat. But the upper reaches of the town, where the ancient castle dominated the skyline, were virtually deserted. Streets that should have been filled with the servants and courtiers who made royal government function were empty, except for the occasional patrol of nervous guards. The castle itself loomed over the scene like a medieval monument to abandoned ambition. Its towers and battlements were clearly ancient, built in an era when kings ruled through personal presence and physical intimidation rather than the more subtle methods of modern statecraft. But what should have been an impressive display of royal power had become something else entirely, a dark silhouette against the sky that seemed to radiate menace rather than majesty. Geralt's first encounter with the local authorities proved both illuminating and frustrating. The miners who had originally raised the funds for Remus's contract were understandably suspicious of another Witcher's arrival. Their previous experience had left them poorer and no safer than before, and they had little reason to trust that this new professional would prove any more reliable than his predecessor. Their hostility was palpable, expressed in muttered curses and hard stares that followed Geralt through the streets. It was clear from their attitudes that they believed Remus had simply taken their money and fled, leaving them to face the monster's continued predations without protection or recourse. The alternative, that he had actually attempted to fulfill his contract and been killed in the process, was apparently too disturbing for them to contemplate. Better to believe in cowardice than to face the possibility that whatever stalked their knights was powerful enough to destroy a fully trained witcher. But it was not the miner's anger that concerned Geralt most. It was the response of the royal guards when they discovered his presence in their city. Rather than the cautious respect that most authorities showed to witchers, these soldiers displayed the kind of aggressive suspicion usually reserved for dangerous criminals. They moved to escort him from Temeria's borders immediately, without giving him a chance to investigate the situation or even speak to anyone in authority. The intervention that saved him from immediate expulsion came from an unexpected source. As the guards closed in around him, their hands moving to their weapons in preparation for enforcing their orders, something strange happened. The soldiers suddenly began to sway in their saddles, their eyes growing unfocused and their movements becoming unsteady. One by one, they slumped forward and then slid from their horses to lie unconscious on the ground, victims of some invisible force that had struck them down without warning. The sorceress who revealed herself in the aftermath of this magical intervention was unlike anyone Geralt had encountered before. Triss Merigold appeared young, hardly more than a girl despite the obvious power she commanded, with the kind of earnest intelligence that marked her as someone who took her responsibilities seriously. Her introduction was refreshingly direct, free of the elaborate games and hidden agendas that characterized most interactions with magical practitioners. She served King Foltest, she explained, but her current mission was her own rather than anything officially sanctioned by the royal court. The creature that had been terrorizing Temeria was indeed a serious threat, but not one that could be simply hunted down and killed like an ordinary monster. What stalked the knight in the castle above them was cursed rather than naturally evil, a victim of magical manipulation rather than an inherently malevolent being. As they made their way through the deserted upper city toward the castle itself, Triss shared what she had learned during her 3 months of investigation. The killings had begun 6 years earlier, with stable hands and castle servants disappearing one by one. The pattern had been gradual at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence or natural causes, but as the death toll mounted and the killings spread beyond the castle walls into the city below, it became clear that something supernatural was responsible. The creature's lair was the tomb where Princess Ada had been laid to rest, a stone chamber beneath the castle that should have been a place of peace and remembrance but had instead become the source of terror and death. Local superstition blamed the princess herself, suggesting that she had risen from her grave to seek vengeance for some perceived wrong. But Triss's investigations had uncovered a far more complex and disturbing truth. Princess Ada had died in childbirth. That much was common knowledge. What was less widely known was that she had been pregnant at the time of her death, carrying a child whose father's identity remained officially unknown. Court gossip suggested various possibilities, from secret lovers to political arrangements gone wrong, but the truth, as Geralt would eventually discover, was far more scandalous than any rumor had dared suggest. The tomb itself was a scene of carnage that spoke to the methodical nature of the creature's feeding habits. The bodies of recent victims lay scattered around the stone sarcophagus that should have contained the princess's remains, their condition suggesting that death had not come quickly or mercifully. But it was the remains of another witcher, partially concealed behind the tomb, that captured Geralt's immediate attention. Remus had not fled with the miner's gold after all. His body, or what remained of it, provided clear evidence of his fate. The precise nature of his injuries told a story that only someone trained in monster lore could read. He had faced something immensely strong and fast. Something that had killed him not through crude violence, but through the kind of selective feeding that characterized only the most dangerous types of cursed beings. The pattern of damage to Remus's corpse, particularly the missing heart and liver, confirmed Triss's theory about the nature of their opponent. They were not dealing with a risen corpse or a vengeful spirit, but with a striga, one of the rarest and most dangerous forms of cursed being. The creature that had killed Remus and terrorized Temeria for 6 years was no ordinary monster, but the transformed offspring of Princess Ada, grown to monstrous size and power within her mother's womb. Strigas were creatures of curse rather than natural evil, born from magical manipulation rather than the normal processes of corruption and decay that created most undead beings. They retained a twisted form of intelligence that made them far more dangerous than simple monsters, capable of planning and patience that allowed them to stalk their prey with terrifying efficiency. Most crucially for Geralt's purposes, they were not necessarily irredeemable. A striga could potentially be cured, restored to its original human form, if the right methods were employed. But such a cure would require more than the silver sword and combat skills that had served Geralt through countless monster hunts. Breaking a striga's curse demanded that the creature be kept from its lair from sunset to sunrise, forced to remain in its human form until the magical bonds that held it could be permanently severed. It was a task that required not just courage, but precise timing and enormous physical endurance. The political complications surrounding the situation became apparent when Triss arranged for Geralt to meet with King Foltest and his advisors. The royal court was divided between those who wanted the creature simply destroyed and those who hoped it might somehow be saved. The king himself seemed torn between his desire to end the threat and his reluctance to definitively seal the fate of what might be his own grandchild. For the striga was more than just a monster born from magical curse. If Princess Ada had indeed been pregnant when she died, and if her child had been transformed rather than killed by the magical forces involved, then the creature represented the sole heir to the Temerian throne. Its death would end the royal bloodline permanently, while its salvation might restore legitimate succession to the kingdom. But the true source of the curse, and the reason for the court's obvious discomfort with Geralt's presence, lay in secrets that went to the heart of royal power itself. The father of Ada's child was not some anonymous courtier or foreign prince, but King Foltest himself. The princess had been both sister and lover to the king, and their incestuous relationship had produced the child whose transformation now threatened the kingdom. The curse itself had been born from the grief and rage of someone who could not accept this violation of natural law. Lord Ostrit, who had served as Ada's confidant and protector, had loved her with a passion that made her relationship with her brother unbearable. In his anguish and fury, he had sought magical means to punish what he saw as an abomination, calling upon powers he did not fully understand to bring justice where human law had failed. But magic, as Geralt had learned through years of dealing with its consequences, rarely produced the results that its practitioners intended. Instead of simply ending Ada's pregnancy or punishing Foltest for his transgression, the curse had transformed the unborn child into something monstrous. The innocent victim of its parents' sins had become an instrument of vengeance that killed indiscriminately, its hunger satisfied by any human flesh rather than focusing on those who had actually committed the original crime. The solution to such a curse could not be found through violence alone. Ostrit's magical working had to be undone through careful ritual and precise timing, with the striga kept from its resting place during the crucial hours when the magical bonds were weakest. It was a task that would test every aspect of Geralt's training and abilities, demanding not just physical prowess but also the kind of moral courage required to risk his life for someone else's salvation. The night he spent in the abandoned castle, waiting for the Striga to emerge from its tomb, was unlike any other in his long career as a monster hunter. The creature that finally appeared was indeed monstrous, a twisted amalgamation of human and beast that moved with predatory grace through the darkened corridors. But beneath its horrific exterior, Geralt could sense something that was unmistakably human. A consciousness trapped within the curse's embrace and crying out for release. The battle that followed was as much about endurance as skill. The Striga was immensely strong and fast, capable of inflicting wounds that would have killed an ordinary man instantly. But Geralt's mutations allowed him to absorb damage that should have been fatal, while his training provided him with the techniques necessary to avoid the creature's most devastating attacks. Most importantly, his understanding of the curse's nature meant that he fought not to kill but to restrain, seeking to protect both himself and the humanity trapped within the monster's form. As the night wore on and the crucial hour approached, Geralt found himself pushed to the very limits of his capabilities. The Striga's attacks grew more frenzied as dawn approached, as if some part of it recognized that its monstrous existence was under threat. The castle itself seemed to participate in the struggle, with shadows that moved independently of their sources and sounds that suggested presences beyond the merely physical. But when the first light of dawn began to filter through the castle's windows, when the magical bonds that held the curse began to weaken under the pressure of the changing night, Geralt's patient strategy finally bore fruit. The creature's attacks became less coordinated, its movements more human than bestial. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable, with human features beginning to emerge from the monstrous exterior. The girl who finally lay exhausted on the stone floor was naked and vulnerable, her body bearing the marks of her long ordeal, but recognizably human once again. Princess Ada, or rather the woman she might have become if the curse had never claimed her, looked up at Geralt with eyes that held no memory of her monstrous existence but carried the weight of years spent in a nightmare she could not understand. But the curse's breaking came at a cost that nearly claimed Geralt's placed life. In the final moments of the transformation, when the Striga's consciousness was caught between its monstrous and human natures, its confusion and fear manifested in one last desperate attack. The claws that raked across Geralt's throat opened wounds that brought him to the very edge of death, his blood flowing onto the stone floor as consciousness faded from his vision. The healing that saved his life was Triss's work, her magic knitting together the damaged flesh and replacing the blood he had lost. But the physical wounds were only part of the price he had paid for the princess's salvation. The experience had forced him to confront questions about the nature of monstrosity and redemption that would haunt him for years to come. The creature he had fought had been both innocent victim and deadly predator, deserving of both compassion and caution. King Foltest's gratitude was genuine but complicated by the political necessities of maintaining royal authority. The official story of the princess's rescue carefully omitted the more disturbing details of her origin and transformation, presenting Geralt as a hero who had saved an innocent victim of magical malevolence. The truth about the royal incest and Ostrit's curse would remain buried beneath layers of diplomatic fiction and carefully crafted lies. But for Geralt himself, the most significant aspect of the entire experience was not the political recognition or the substantial payment he received for his services. It was the conversation he had with Triss in the aftermath of the cure, when she spoke of destiny and the strange patterns that seemed to govern the lives of those touched by magic. Her words echoed Renfri's prophecy, suggesting that his encounter with the cursed princess was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern that was slowly revealing itself. The Witcher who rode away from Temeria's capital carried with him more than just the satisfaction of a contract successfully completed. He had learned that curses could be broken, that monsters were not always irredeemable, and that the choice between destruction and salvation was often more complex than his training had prepared him to handle. Most importantly, he had begun to understand that his own destiny might involve more than simply hunting monsters and collecting payment for services rendered. The path ahead remained uncertain, filled with contracts and dangers that he could not yet anticipate. But somewhere in the distance, drawing closer with each choice he made and each life he touched, waited the fulfillment of prophecies he was still trying to deny. The girl in the woods that Renfri had promised him, the child whose destiny would become intertwined with his own in ways that neither training nor experience had prepared him to understand. The years following Geralt's triumph in Temeria brought a kind of rhythm to his life on the path that had previously been absent. The successful cure of the Striga had begun to change his reputation in ways that went beyond even Jaskia's enthusiastic ballads. Where once he had been known primarily as the Butcher of Blaviken, now stories began to circulate about the White Wolf who chose healing over killing when such choices were possible. Contracts came more frequently, and with them a grudging respect from clients who had heard that this particular witcher might find solutions that others would miss. It was this growing reputation that brought him the invitation to attend a royal betrothal in the kingdom of Sintra, though the invitation itself came through characteristically indirect channels. Jaskia had received word that his presence would be welcomed at the celebration, and where the bard went, Geralt typically followed. The prospect of spending an evening surrounded by nobles and courtiers held little appeal for the Witcher, but Jaskia's enthusiasm was infectious, and the promise of good food and better wine after months on dusty roads provided sufficient motivation. The journey to Sintra took them through some of the most beautiful countryside in the northern kingdoms. Rolling hills dotted with prosperous farms and vineyards that spoke of peace and stability rare in those troubled times. Queen Calanthe's realm had managed to avoid the worst of the conflicts that plagued its neighbors, maintaining its independence through a combination of military strength and diplomatic cunning that had earned the lioness her fearsome reputation. The royal castle that awaited them was a magnificent sight, its banners flying proudly in the coastal breeze and its walls gleaming white in the afternoon sun. The celebration itself promised to be a grand affair, with nobles and dignitaries arriving from across the continent to witness Princess Pavetta's betrothal to Lord Craich and Crate of Skellig. It was exactly the kind of political alliance that secured peace between kingdoms and ensured profitable trade relationships for generations to come. But even as they approached the castle gates, Geralt sensed undercurrents of tension that suggested this celebration might prove more complicated than appearances indicated. His enhanced hearing picked up fragments of conversations among the arriving guests, whispered concerns about the political implications of the match and speculation about whether Queen Calanthe had chosen the best possible husband for her daughter. There was something in the air, a quality of anticipation that went beyond the normal excitement of a royal wedding. Inside the castle, the Great Hall had been transformed into a spectacular venue for the ceremony and feast that would follow. Tapestries bearing the arms of Sintra and Skellige hung from the walls, while tables groaned under the weight of delicacies that had been imported from across the known world. Musicians played softly in the background, their melodies providing an elegant soundtrack for the conversations and negotiations that were the real business of such gatherings. Jaskia was in his element, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in such company. His noble birth and academy education had prepared him for exactly this sort of event, and he navigated the complex social hierarchies with an ease that Geralt could only admire. The bard's introductions opened doors that would have remained firmly closed to a witcher traveling alone, providing access to conversations and insights that would have otherwise been impossible. It was through one of these introductions that Geralt first encountered Mousak, the druid who served as Queen Calanthe's advisor and whose presence at the ceremony immediately caught the witcher's attention. There was something about the man that set him apart from the other courtiers and nobles, a quality of ancient wisdom and barely contained power that spoke of abilities far beyond the merely political. When their eyes met across the crowded hall, Geralt felt the familiar tingle of recognition that came when one practitioner of the supernatural arts encountered another. But it was Queen Calanthe herself who provided the evening's first real surprise. The Lioness of Cintra was everything her reputation had suggested and more, a woman who commanded attention simply by entering a room and whose presence seemed to charge the very air with electricity. When she singled Geralt out for conversation, drawing him to sit beside her at the high table, every eye in the hall followed their movement with intense curiosity. The Queen's interest in him was clearly more than mere courtesy to a guest. Her questions about his encounters with elves and monsters, her obvious knowledge of his reputation and methods, all suggested that she had been following his career with considerable attention. There was something almost predatory in the way she studied him, as if she were evaluating his potential usefulness for purposes he could not yet understand. Their conversation was interrupted by the formal beginning of the betrothal ceremony. As Princess Pavetta was escorted into the hall to meet her intended husband, the princess was breathtakingly beautiful, with the kind of ethereal grace that seemed to illuminate the space around her. But as Geralt watched her approach the altar where Lord Cratch waited, he noticed something that troubled him. The girl's movements seemed mechanical, lacking the joy and anticipation that one might expect from a bride approaching her wedding day. The ceremony itself proceeded according to ancient tradition, with formal declarations of intent and exchanges of symbolic gifts that bound the two houses together in alliance. Lord Cratch played his part with dignity and obvious affection for his young bride, while Princess Pavetta responded with the kind of practiced composure that spoke of careful training in royal deportment. To most observers, it was exactly what such ceremonies were supposed to be, a harmonious union that would benefit both kingdoms. But Geralt's enhanced senses detected undercurrents that the formal proceedings could not entirely conceal. The princess's heartbeat was elevated in a way that suggested anxiety rather than excitement. Her scent carried traces of fear and something else, something that spoke of secrets and hidden complications. Most tellingly, her eyes constantly scanned the crowd as if searching for someone who was not present. The disruption, when it came, was both shocking and somehow inevitable. The great doors of the hall burst open just as the formal betrothal was reaching its climax, and through them strode a figure that transformed the entire atmosphere of the celebration in an instant. The newcomer was clearly a knight, his armor marking him as someone of noble birth and military training, but his face was hidden beneath a helmet that concealed his features entirely. Lord Urchin of Erlenwald, as he announced himself, had come to claim Princess Pavetta's hand in marriage, and his claim was based not on political alliance or romantic attachment, but on the ancient law of surprise. 12 years earlier, he explained to the shocked assembly, he had saved the life of Queen Calanthe's husband, King Rogner, and had been offered any reward within the king's power to grant. Following tradition, he had chosen the law of surprise, asking for the first thing the king found upon returning home that he did not expect. That unexpected discovery had been Queen Calanthe's pregnancy with Princess Pavetta, and by the law of surprise, the unborn child now belonged to Lord Urchin as payment for his service to her father. It was a claim that no one could legally dispute, regardless of how inconvenient it might prove to existing political arrangements. The law of surprise was one of the oldest and most sacred obligations recognized throughout the northern kingdoms, and violation of it would bring disaster upon any who dared to break such bonds. But Queen Calanthe was not a woman who accepted challenges to her authority without resistance, particularly when those challenges threatened her carefully laid plans for her daughter's future. Her response to Lord Urchin's claim was swift and decisive. Rather than honoring the ancient law, she ordered her guards to attack the uninvited guest and remove him from her hall by force. The celebration transformed into a battlefield in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The combat that followed revealed Lord Urchin to be a warrior of exceptional skill, easily a match for multiple opponents despite being outnumbered and surrounded. But it also revealed something else, something that changed the entire nature of the conflict. As his helmet was struck from his head during the fighting, the assembled nobles gasped in horror at what they saw. Lord Urchin's face was not human but bestial, covered in coarse fur and dominated by features that belonged more to a wild boar than to a man. The revelation of his cursed condition sent shockwaves through the hall, with many of the guests recoiling in terror from what they took to be a monster in their midst. Queen Calanthe's demand that Geralt kill the creature seemed perfectly reasonable under the circumstances, the natural response to discovering that a dangerous supernatural being had infiltrated their celebration. But Geralt's training and experience told him that the situation was far more complex than it appeared. Lord Urchin was indeed cursed, but he was not a monster in the conventional sense. His condition was clearly magical in origin, the result of some spell or enchantment rather than natural corruption or evil intent. More importantly, his behavior since entering the hall had been that of a desperate man seeking justice rather than a creature bent on destruction. The law of surprise was a legitimate claim, whatever his appearance might suggest about his worthiness to press it. Geralt's decision to protect Lord Urchin rather than destroy him transformed him from observer to participant in the evening's drama. Fighting alongside the cursed knight against Queen Calanthe's guards, he found himself defending principles that went beyond simple monster hunting. The law of surprise was more than just ancient tradition. It was a recognition that some debts transcended political convenience and personal preference. The battle raged across the great hall, with furniture splintering under the impact of weapons and noble guests scrambling for safety wherever they could find it. But even as the violence escalated around them, Geralt became aware that this was not the central drama of the evening. Princess Pavetta's reaction to Lord Urchin's appearance, her obvious recognition and concern for him despite his monstrous features, told a very different story than the one her mother had been telling. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both simpler and more complex than anyone had anticipated. Lord Urchin was not a stranger who had come to claim an unwilling bride through legal technicality. He was Dunny, the man Princess Pavetta had been secretly meeting, and with whom she had fallen deeply in love. His curse was not a mark of evil, but the result of magical accident, a transformation that had made their relationship impossible in the eyes of the world, but had not changed the feelings they shared. Their love story, as it unfolded in the midst of the chaos, was one of the most poignant that Geralt had ever encountered. Dunny had lived with his curse for years, convinced that no one could ever love him in his transformed state. When he had saved King Rognar's life and been offered a reward, he had chosen the law of surprise not out of hope but out of despair, never imagining that he would actually claim what was owed to him. The discovery that a child was involved had made him abandon all thoughts of pressing his legal right. But destiny, that force which Geralt was learning to both respect and fear, had other plans. When Princess Pavetta had encountered Dunny by chance during one of her rides through the forest, she had seen past his monstrous exterior to the man beneath. Their secret meetings had blossomed into genuine love, the kind of deep connection that transcended physical appearance or social expectation. It was Princess Pavetta who had convinced him to come to the betrothal ceremony, to claim what was rightfully his before she was bound to another. The magical explosion that followed Princess Pavetta's emotional revelation changed everything in the hall, both literally and figuratively. The princess's latent magical abilities, awakened by the intensity of her feelings, sent everyone flying across the room with a force that demonstrated powers beyond anything the assembled nobles had ever witnessed. As she and Duni floated above the chaos, surrounded by magical energy that made the very air shimmer with power, it became clear that forces greater than politics or tradition were at work. Geralt's intervention to bring them safely back to Earth was instinctive, driven by concern for their safety rather than any desire to interfere with the magical display. But his action also served to restore calm to a situation that had spiraled completely beyond anyone's control. In the aftermath of the magical storm, with furniture scattered and guests slowly picking themselves up from the floor, Queen Calanthe found herself faced with a choice that would determine not only her daughter's future, but the fate of her kingdom. The decision to honor the law of surprise, to allow Princess Pavetta to marry the man she loved rather than the political alliance her mother had arranged, was not an easy one for Queen Calanthe to make. It represented a fundamental shift in how she understood power and authority, an acknowledgement that some forces were beyond even royal control. But the magical display they had all witnessed made it clear that opposing her daughter's will might have consequences that went far beyond political inconvenience. The blessing of the marriage that followed was more than mere ceremony. It was an acceptance of destiny's role in shaping human affairs. When Princess Pavetta kissed her new husband and his curse was broken, transforming him back into the handsome man he had been before his magical accident, it seemed as though the very universe was celebrating their union. The love that had survived curse and separation had proven stronger than any obstacle that had been placed in its path. But the evening's surprises were not yet complete. When Duni, now revealed in his true form as a prince worthy of his royal bride, offered to reward Geralt for his intervention, the Witcher found himself facing a choice that would echo through the rest of his long life. The traditional response would have been to accept gold or some other material reward, the kind of payment that could support him through many months on the path. Instead, following an impulse he did not fully understand, Geralt invoked the law of surprise himself. It was meant as a gesture of respect for the tradition they had just witnessed triumph over political convenience, a way of honoring the ancient customs that had brought Duni and Pavetta together. He had no intention of actually claiming anything from them, no expectation that the law would provide him with anything more valuable than the satisfaction of completing the circle of obligation and reward. But destiny, it seemed, had been waiting for exactly this moment. Princess Pavetta's sudden nausea, her obvious distress at what should have been the happiest moment of her life, revealed the truth that would bind Geralt to the royal family of Cintra for generations to come. She was with child, and by the law of surprise that Geralt had just invoked, that child now belonged to him. The implications of this revelation were staggering and immediate. Maussac's warnings about the dangers of dismissing such bonds, his insistence that destiny could not be denied without terrible consequences, suddenly took on new urgency. The child growing within Princess Pavetta's womb was not just another royal heir, but something far more significant, a being whose fate would be intertwined with Geralt's own in ways that neither prophecy nor wisdom could fully predict. The magical potential that Princess Pavetta had displayed during the evening's crisis would likely be passed on to her child, possibly in even greater measure. Such power, combined with the ancient bloodlines of Cintra and the mysterious heritage that Duni brought to the Union, might produce someone whose abilities would reshape the very nature of the world they inhabited. To be bound to such a child by the law of surprise was to accept a responsibility that went far beyond anything Geralt had ever contemplated. But even as Mausersac explained the magnitude of what had just occurred, even as he warned of the catastrophes that might follow if Geralt tried to flee from his new obligation, the Witcher found himself unable to accept what seemed to be inevitable. His entire life had been built around the principle of choice, the belief that he could determine his own path regardless of what others expected or demanded of him. The idea that his future had just been decided by ancient law and magical accident was more than he could bear to acknowledge. His departure from Sintra that night was an act of denial rather than wisdom, a desperate attempt to outrun a destiny that had already begun to unfold. The law of surprise might bind him to Princess Pavetta's unborn child in theory, but Geralt convinced himself that distance and determination could break any chain that he refused to accept. He had survived Blaviken's condemnation and countless monster hunts. Surely he could survive the consequences of one evening's magical entanglements. But as he rode away from the castle with Jaskia beside him, the bard already composing ballads about the evening's extraordinary events, Geralt carried with him more than just memories of magical displays and royal drama. Deep within his enhanced hearing, barely perceptible even to his supernatural senses, he could detect the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that was not his own. Somewhere in the castle behind them, a child was growing who would one day call him father, whether he was prepared for that role or not. The path stretched ahead of them once again, familiar and comforting in its uncertainty. There were always more contracts to complete, more monsters to hunt, more problems to solve for people who could pay his fees and then forget his existence until they needed him again. It was a life he understood, one that made sense in ways that prophecies and magical bonds did not. But destiny, he was beginning to learn, was not a force that could be escaped through simple geography or stubborn refusal to acknowledge its power. The child of surprise was coming, whether Geralt was ready or not, and with it would come changes that would transform everything he thought he understood about his own nature and purpose. The Witcher who had spent his life believing that he was incapable of normal human connections was about to discover that love and family could take forms that no training had prepared him to recognize or handle. The path would continue, but it would never be the same again. The years following Geralt's flight from Sintra and the obligations he had inadvertently accepted there brought a restlessness to his travels that even Jaskia's company could not entirely dispel. The Witcher found himself taking contracts in increasingly remote locations, as if distance alone could somehow break the invisible threads that connected him to a child he had never seen and a destiny he refused to acknowledge. But the path, which had once provided refuge from the complications of human emotion and expectation, now seemed to lead him through landscapes haunted by possibilities he could not escape. It was during one of these aimless wanderings, when summer heat had driven them to seek shelter by a lake whose waters promised relief from the oppressive temperature, that Geralt encountered the bottle that would change everything. The object lay at the bottom of the shallow water like a piece of forgotten treasure, its surface inscribed with symbols that spoke of magical containment and ancient power. Jaskia, ever curious about anything that might provide material for future songs, was immediately fascinated by their discovery. The djinn that emerged when the bottle's seal was broken was unlike anything either of them had expected. Rather than the grateful spirit of folklore, bound to grant wishes in exchange for freedom, this creature radiated malevolence and barely contained power that made the very air around them crackle with supernatural energy. Its form shifted and flowed like smoke given substance, and its voice carried undertones that spoke of dimensions far removed from the mundane world of human concerns. Jaskia's attempts to control the situation, his frantic efforts to speak the words that would bind the djinn to his will, resulted in disaster rather than mastery. The magical backlash that followed left the bard writhing in agony, his throat constricted by forces that threatened to crush the life from his body. The djinn's laughter, as it escaped into the wider world, was a sound that promised suffering for anyone unfortunate enough to cross its path in the hours and days to come. The desperate search for healing that followed led Geralt through a landscape transformed by magical chaos into something alien and dangerous. The djinn's passage had left its mark on everything it touched, turning familiar forests into twisted mazes and peaceful streams into torrents that flowed uphill against all natural law. The few people they encountered spoke in whispers of strange dreams and waking nightmares that had begun to plague the region since the creature's liberation. But it was in the town of Rinde that Geralt finally found both the help Jaskia desperately needed and the woman who would become the greatest love and most enduring torment of his long life. Yennefer of Vengerberg was everything that the stories had promised and nothing that he had expected. A sorceress whose beauty was matched only by the obvious intelligence that burned behind her violet eyes like flame behind colored glass. Their first encounter was a study in mutual assessment disguised as casual conversation. Yennefer's immediate recognition of his nature, her easy familiarity with the mutations that marked him as different from ordinary men, spoke of knowledge that went far beyond academic study. When she referred to him as the White Wolf, when she expressed curiosity about fangs and horns that existed only in popular imagination, Geralt understood that he was dealing with someone who collected information about dangerous individuals as a matter of professional necessity. The magical working that had transformed Rinde's population into willing participants in an elaborate orgy was impressive in both its scope and its subtlety. The enchantment had not simply overridden the townspeople's natural inhibitions, but had created a collective fantasy so compelling that none of them questioned the strange compulsions that had seized them. It was exactly the kind of complex manipulation that marked Yennefer as a sorceress of considerable power and questionable ethics. But her willingness to heal Jaskia in exchange for Geralt's company suggested motivations that went beyond simple mercenary calculation. The cure she provided was swift and thorough, removing not just the immediate threat to the bard's life, but also the underlying magical contamination that might have caused complications later. It was the work of someone who understood both the djinn's nature and the specific requirements of countering its malevolent influence. The conversation that followed, as they shared the intimacy of the bathhouse while Jaskia recovered from his ordeal, revealed depths and complexities that Geralt had not anticipated. Yennefer's questions about his past, her obvious knowledge of the processes that had created him, demonstrated an interest that seemed both academic and personal. Her own scars, barely visible beneath the magical glamours that enhanced her beauty, told stories of transformation and loss that paralleled his own experience in ways that mere coincidence could not explain. The truth about her origins, when she finally chose to share it, painted a picture of suffering that made Geralt's own difficult childhood seem almost comfortable by comparison. The hunchbacked girl who had been transformed into one of the most beautiful and powerful sorceresses of her age had paid prices that few could imagine, and fewer still would have been willing to accept. The magical processes that had given her beauty and power had also taken away the possibility of motherhood, leaving her with abilities that could reshape reality, but not the basic human connection she most desperately desired. Their lovemaking that first night was a revelation for both of them, a physical and emotional connection that transcended the merely carnal to touch something deeper and more fundamental. For Geralt, who had spent years believing that his mutations had deadened his capacity for normal human feeling, the intensity of his response to Yennefer's touch was both thrilling and terrifying. For Yennefer, who had used her beauty and sexuality as tools of manipulation and control, the genuine desire she felt for the Witcher represented a vulnerability that her survival instincts warned her against. But even as they discovered the depth of their connection, even as they found in each other something that neither had expected to experience, the complications that would define their relationship were already manifesting themselves. Yennefer's plan to capture the djinn for her own purposes, her willingness to use Geralt's connection to the creature as a means of achieving her goals, demonstrated the calculating nature that made her both fascinating and dangerous. The magical compulsion that she placed upon him, the subtle enchantment that turned him into her unwilling instrument of revenge against the town council that sought to exile her, was a violation of trust that cut deeper than any physical wound. To wake up in a prison cell with no memory of the actions that had placed him there, to learn that he had become a weapon in someone else's hands, challenged everything Geralt believed about his own agency and moral responsibility. The explanation that followed, Yennefer's casual admission that she had manipulated his mind and body to serve her purposes, was delivered with the kind of matter-of-fact pragmatism that spoke of someone accustomed to using whatever tools were available to achieve desired outcomes. Her justification, that the town council members she had targeted deserved punishment for their treatment of her, demonstrated a worldview that placed personal convenience above principles of justice or consent. Yet even as Geralt struggled with the implications of what she had done to him, even as he confronted the reality that the woman he was falling in love with was capable of treating him as nothing more than a useful object, he could not deny the connection that continued to draw them together. The scent of lilac and gooseberries that surrounded her had become as essential to his well-being as food or water, and her absence created an emptiness that no amount of professional activity could fill. The final confrontation with the djinn, when Yennefer's attempt to become its vessel threatened to destroy both of them, forced Geralt to confront the true nature of his feelings for her. The sight of her struggling to contain forces that would have consumed anyone else, her determination to achieve her goals even at the cost of her own life, revealed both her magnificent courage and her fundamental inability to accept the limitations that others took for granted. His third and final wish, the words that freed the djinn and saved Yennefer's life, remained his secret in the aftermath of their shared ordeal. The magic that had bound them together during those desperate moments had created something that transcended simple physical attraction or intellectual compatibility. What they shared was deeper and more complex than either had experienced before. A connection that would survive separations and misunderstandings that would have destroyed lesser bonds. But the relationship that developed between them over the following years was as tempestuous as it was profound, marked by periods of passionate reunion and bitter separation that reflected their fundamental incompatibility as much as their undeniable attraction. Yennefer's ambition and desire for power conflicted with Geralt's growing understanding of his own destiny, while his commitment to the path and the obligations it entailed often took him away from her at moments when she most needed his support. The hunt for the green dragon that brought them together again years later provided a stage for the playing out of all these tensions and more. Yennefer's participation in the expedition was motivated not by gold or glory, but by her desperate hope that dragon's blood might provide the key to restoring her fertility and giving her the child she had been denied by her magical transformation. It was a quest that combined her greatest desire with her deepest vulnerability, making her both more dangerous and more sympathetic than Geralt had ever seen her. The revelation of her true purpose, her confession that she sought the dragon not for its treasure, but for the possibility of motherhood it might represent, forced Geralt to confront his own limitations and assumptions. His casual dismissal of fertility magic as mere superstition, his inability to understand why someone with Yennefer's power and independence would want something as commonplace as a child, revealed the gaps in his understanding of human nature that his mutations and training had created. Their confrontation over his child of surprise, his admission that he had already been granted the very thing she most desperately wanted, opened wounds that went to the heart of their relationship. Yennefer's fury was not simply jealousy or resentment, but a deeper rage at the casual way the universe seemed to grant to others what it had denied to her. That Geralt had been offered a child and had rejected the gift made her feel as though her own desperate longing was being mocked by fate itself. The dragon's lair, when they finally reached it, provided the setting for revelations that changed everyone's understanding of the situation they had entered. The green dragon whose death had supposedly motivated their quest was already dead, killed not by treasure hunters, but by the simple exhaustion of attempting to protect her young, in a world that showed no mercy to creatures deemed monstrous by human standards. The egg that lay beside her corpse represented not just another generation of an endangered species, but the hope for continuation that every parent carries. The golden dragon's revelation of his true nature, his explanation of why he had orchestrated their entire expedition, provided a framework for understanding the complexities that had driven them all to this remote mountain cave. Villon Trettenmirth had not been seeking adventure or testing their worthiness, but fulfilling the same protective instincts that had driven the green dragon to fight and die for her offspring. His deception had been motivated not by malice, but by the recognition that sometimes the only way to save something precious was to hide it from those who would exploit or destroy it. The final confrontation with the Reavers who had followed them to the dragon's lair became both a battle for survival and a test of the bonds that connected the various members of their expedition. The violence that followed was swift and brutal, with Yennefer's magic proving as deadly as Geralt's sword in eliminating the threat to the dragons and their unborn child. But the victory came at a cost that would echo through their relationship for years to come. It was in the aftermath of the battle, as they prepared to leave the mountain and return to their separate paths, that the truth about Geralt's third wish finally came to light. Yennefer's realization that their connection had been magically reinforced, that her feelings for him might be the product of supernatural compulsion rather than genuine emotion, shattered something fundamental in their relationship that could never be completely repaired. The argument that followed was both inevitable and heartbreaking, a confrontation between two people who loved each other deeply but could no longer trust the authenticity of that love. Yennefer's accusation that Geralt had enslaved her emotions, that he had used magic to create a bond she would never have chosen freely, was met with his desperate insistence that the wish had been motivated by love rather than possession. But the doubt had been planted, and doubt was a poison that no amount of explanation or protestation could neutralize. Their separation at the mountain's base was both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of one phase of their relationship and the start of another that would be defined by longing and loss rather than presence and passion. The love that connected them had not died, but it had been wounded in ways that would make future happiness difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. Villon Trettenmirth's final words to them, his prophecy about the pain they would cause each other and the emptiness that would define their future apart, carried the weight of ancient wisdom and terrible compassion. The dragon had seen enough of mortal love to understand both its power and its fragility, and his warning about the price they would pay for their choices was delivered with the sadness of someone who had witnessed too many similar tragedies. Geralt's explosion of rage at Jaskier, his brutal dismissal of the friend who had shared his adventures and helped shape his reputation, was the product of grief and frustration rather than genuine anger. But the words, once spoken, could not be taken back, and the bard's departure left Geralt more alone than he had been since his earliest days on the path. The companions who had given meaning and purpose to his wanderings were gone, scattered by choices and misunderstandings that seemed impossible to repair. The solitude that followed was different from anything Geralt had previously experienced. Where once he had chosen isolation as a refuge from the complications of human connection, now it was imposed upon him by his own mistakes and the consequences of choices he could not undo. The path stretched ahead of him as it always had, filled with contracts and dangers that would test his skills and challenge his understanding. But it was a colder road now, marked by the absence of voices that had made even the most difficult journeys bearable. Yet somewhere in the distance, drawing closer with each passing season, waited the fulfillment of obligations he had tried so hard to deny. The child of surprise was growing toward the moment when destiny would demand its due, and no amount of anger or regret could change what had been set in motion years earlier in Sintra's royal hall. The future that Geralt had tried to avoid was approaching, whether he was prepared for it or not. And with it would come the chance for redemption, or the confirmation of his deepest fears about his own nature and worthiness. The love he had found and lost with Yennefer had changed him in ways that went far beyond the merely emotional. He had discovered that his mutations had not destroyed his capacity for deep feeling, that the heart he thought had been sacrificed to create the perfect monster hunter was still beating beneath his armored exterior. That knowledge was both blessing and curse, opening him to possibilities he had never imagined, while also making him vulnerable to pain that a truly emotionless creature would never have to endure. The path called to him still, offering the familiar comfort of problems that could be solved with silver swords and well-placed signs. But Geralt was no longer the same man who had first walked that road, no longer the isolated professional who believed that relationships were luxuries he could not afford. He had learned that love was possible, even for someone like him, and that knowledge would shape every choice he made in the years to come. The years of solitude that followed Geralt's bitter parting from both Yennefer and Jaskia settled over him like a familiar cloak, though this time the isolation carried a weight that had not been there before. Where once he had chosen to walk alone by preference, finding peace in the simplicity of contracts completed and roads travelled without the complications of companionship, now the silence felt like punishment rather than refuge. The path stretched ahead of him as it always had, but it was a colder road now, marked by the absence of voices that had made even the most difficult journeys bearable. The contracts that sustained him during this period were routine affairs, the kind of straightforward monster hunts that required skill and preparation, but little in the way of moral complexity. A drowner nest that had made a river crossing impassable for merchant caravans. A pack of wolves whose unusual size and aggression marked them as having been touched by magic. A haunting that proved to be nothing more than settling timbers and an overactive imagination, though the payment was real enough to make the investigation worthwhile. But even as he threw himself into this work with renewed focus, even as he travelled farther and took on more dangerous contracts than wisdom might have suggested, Geralt could not escape the growing sense that he was running from something that could not be outrun. The child of surprise that he had claimed and then abandoned was no longer an abstract obligation that could be ignored indefinitely. 12 years had passed since that night in Sintra, and somewhere in Queen Calanthe's palace, a young woman was approaching the age when destiny would no longer be denied. The signs that something fundamental was changing in the world around him were subtle at first, but gradually became impossible to ignore. Refugees appeared on roads that had once been safe, carrying stories of armies moving south with banners that bore unfamiliar heraldry. Merchants spoke in hushed tones of kingdoms that had fallen overnight, their rulers dead or fled, and their people scattered to whatever shelter they could find. The comfortable stability that had characterized the northern kingdoms for generations was crumbling, and in its place was rising something that threatened to reshape the entire continent. Nilfgaard had always been a distant concern for those who lived in the northern territories, a southern empire whose ambitions seemed focused on lands too far away to affect the daily lives of farmers and craftsmen who had never seen the sea. But the reports that began to filter northward told of a military machine unlike anything the world had seen, commanded by leaders who combined tactical brilliance with ruthless efficiency. Cities that had withstood sieges for months in previous conflicts fell to Nilfgaardian forces in days, their walls breached by innovations in siegecraft, and their defenders overwhelmed by disciplined troops who fought with the coordination of a single organism. It was during this period of growing unease that Geralt encountered Mausersack again, though the circumstances of their meeting were far different from the festive celebration where they had first been introduced. The druid was travelling in disguise through the war-torn countryside, his usual robes and staff exchanged for the simple garments of a common merchant. But his eyes held the same ancient wisdom that had impressed Geralt years earlier, and his greeting carried an urgency that immediately commanded attention. The message that Mausersack carried was both invitation and warning, a request for Geralt to return to Sintra, combined with information about the forces that were moving against Queen Calanthe's kingdom. The druid had seen the Nilfgaardian army firsthand, had witnessed the systematic destruction they left in their wake, and he understood better than most what their advance towards Sintra would mean for the princess who had grown up in the palace's protected halls. But Mausersack's most urgent concern was not the external threat that Nilfgaard represented, but the internal damage that Queen Calanthe's attempts to deny destiny had caused within her own family. Princess Ciri, as she was now known, had been raised in ignorance of her connection to Geralt, told only that her parents had died in a storm at sea and that she was the sole heir to Sintra's throne. The lore of surprise that should have prepared her for the role she was destined to play had been treated as superstition rather than sacred obligation, leaving her unprepared for the forces that were beginning to manifest around her. The magical abilities that Ciri had inherited from her bloodline were growing stronger as she approached womanhood, but without proper training or understanding, they were as likely to destroy her as to protect her from the dangers that awaited. The elder blood that flowed through her veins carried power that few could comprehend and fewer still could control. And Queen Calanthe's attempts to pretend that her granddaughter was an ordinary princess were doomed to catastrophic failure. Geralt's initial response to Mausersack's plea was the same stubborn refusal that had characterized his approach to the Child of Surprise for 12 years. He had made his choice at the dragon hunt, had walked away from obligations that he never wanted and could not fulfill. The idea that he could somehow step into the role of father and protector for a young woman he had never met, who had been raised to see him as nothing more than a distant threat to her family's happiness, seemed both presumptuous and impossible. But Mausersack's patience with such denials had worn thin over the years, and his response carried an edge of desperation that cut through Geralt's defenses. The druid had watched empires rise and fall, had seen the consequences of ignoring destiny's demands, and he understood better than anyone what would happen if Ciri faced the challenges ahead without the guidance that only her true protector could provide. The Child of Surprise was not a burden that Geralt could continue to ignore, but a responsibility that would claim him whether he accepted it willingly or not. The attack on their camp that night came without warning, a coordinated assault by armed men whose efficiency and equipment marked them as professionals rather than common bandits. The fight was brief but vicious, with Geralt's enhanced reflexes and combat training proving decisive against opponents who had clearly underestimated what they were facing. But the assassination attempt served its purpose even in failure, demonstrating that forces opposed to Geralt's involvement in Sintra's affairs were prepared to take extreme measures to prevent his return. The implications of the attack were clear enough even without Mausersack's explanation. Queen Calanthe had not simply been content to keep Ciri ignorant of her destiny. She had actively worked to ensure that Geralt would never be in a position to claim what was owed to him. The men who had tried to kill him that night were likely not the first such attempt, and they would certainly not be the last. The Lioness of Sintra was fighting a war on multiple fronts, against both external enemies and internal obligations that threatened her carefully constructed vision of her family's future. But destiny, as Geralt was learning with increasing clarity, was not a force that could be defeated through determination or military might. The magical portal that transported them directly into Sintra's throne room was Mausersack's demonstration of powers that few fully understood, a reminder that the supernatural forces at work in their world operated according to rules that transcended political authority or personal preference. Queen Calanthe might command armies and rule kingdoms, but she could not command the fundamental forces that governed fate itself. The confrontation that followed was everything that Geralt had expected and dreaded. A meeting between two strong-willed individuals whose mutual antagonism had been building for over a decade. Queen Calanthe was everything her reputation had promised, a woman who radiated authority and barely controlled violence, whose every gesture spoke of someone accustomed to having her will obeyed without question. But there was something else in her eyes as well, a desperation that suggested she understood the futility of her position, even as she refused to acknowledge it. Her attempts to buy him off, to offer gold and titles in exchange for abandoning his claim to Ciri, revealed both her fundamental misunderstanding of what bound him to her family and her complete inability to accept that some things could not be purchased or negotiated away. The law of surprise was not a debt that could be settled with coin, but a sacred obligation that connected souls across generations. To treat it as a mere commercial transaction was to misunderstand its very nature, but it was Ciri herself who provided the greatest surprise of their encounter. The young woman who had been hidden away in the palace chambers was not the sheltered princess that Geralt had expected, but someone whose intelligence and spirit clearly marked her as worthy of her remarkable heritage. Her reaction to meeting the Witcher who had supposedly threatened her family's happiness was curiosity rather than fear, and her questions revealed a mind that hungered for truth regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might prove to be. The deception that Queen Calanthe attempted, her plan to send Geralt away with a substitute while keeping the real Ciri safely hidden, was both predictable and ultimately pointless. A Witcher's enhanced senses could not be fooled by simple disguises or switched identities, and the magical resonance that connected him to his child of surprise created a recognition that went far beyond physical appearance. The girl she tried to pass off as Ciri was innocent of any wrongdoing, but she was not the person that destiny had bound to Geralt's fate. The revelation of the substitution led to another confrontation that laid bare all the tensions and fears that had been building within Cintra's royal family. Queen Calanthe's admission that she would never willingly surrender Ciri to anyone, her declaration that she had already lost one daughter and would not lose another, provided insight into the grief and protective fury that drove her actions. But understanding her motivations did not make her choices any less dangerous for everyone involved. The imprisonment that followed was both inevitable and temporary, a gesture of defiance that could not change the fundamental realities of the situation they all faced. Geralt's cell might hold his body, but it could not contain the obligations that connected him to Ciri or the destiny that was rapidly approaching its fulfillment. Outside the castle walls, armies were massing for a conflict that would determine the fate of kingdoms, and inside those same walls, magical forces were building toward a confrontation that none of them fully understood. The fall of Cintra, when it finally came, was swift and brutal beyond anything that Queen Calanthe's preparations had anticipated. The Nilfgaardian forces that swept over the kingdom's defenses were not the conventional army that her military advisors had planned to face, but something far more sophisticated and deadly. Their coordination spoke of commanders who understood both the art of war and the importance of psychological warfare, and their efficiency in eliminating resistance suggested a level of planning that had been years in the making. Geralt's escape from his prison came not through his own efforts but through the chaos that engulfed the castle, as defending forces collapsed under the Nilfgaardian assault. The guards who should have kept him locked away were either dead or fleeing, leaving him free to make his way through corridors that echoed with the sounds of battle and desperate flight. But his freedom came too late to prevent the tragedy that was unfolding around him. Too late to fulfill the protective role that he had spent 12 years trying to deny. The sight of Queen Calanthe's broken body in the courtyard below was both shocking and inevitable, the final gesture of a woman who had chosen death over surrender. Her leap from the castle walls was not cowardice, but the last act of defiance available to someone who understood that her capture would be used to legitimize the conquest of her kingdom. In death, she remained the lioness of Cintra, denying her enemies even the satisfaction of parading her defeat before the world. But Ciri was nowhere to be found among the dead and dying, neither in the castle chambers where she should have been protected, nor among the bodies that littered the courtyard. The frantic search that followed led Geralt through scenes of destruction that would haunt his dreams for years to come. But it revealed no trace of the young woman whose safety had become his responsibility whether he had accepted it or not. She had vanished into the chaos of the falling kingdom, lost somewhere in the maelstrom of war and magical forces that had been unleashed by the conflict. The journey that began with that desperate search would take Geralt through landscapes transformed by war into something alien and dangerous. The orderly countryside that had once characterized this region had given way to scenes of systematic destruction, with burned villages and abandoned farmsteads marking the path of armies that showed no mercy to civilian populations. Refugees clogged the roads when there were any roads left to travel, their faces marked by the kind of hollow despair that came from losing everything they had ever valued. It was among these displaced and desperate people that Geralt encountered Yerga, a merchant whose simple humanity would prove to be exactly what the situation required. The man was risking his own life to provide proper burial for Cintran refugees who had been slaughtered by ghouls, creatures drawn by the scent of death and decay that hung over the war-torn landscape like a pall. His determination to show respect for the dead, even when his own survival was at stake, marked him as someone whose character transcended the brutal pragmatism that war typically demanded. The ghoul attack that followed was swift and backhanded, vicious, with creatures emerging from the ground beneath their feet in numbers that suggested the entire region had become a feeding ground for supernatural scavengers. Geralt's intervention saved Yerga's life, but it came at a cost that would prove nearly fatal. The bite he received during the battle was not simply a physical wound, but a vector for supernatural corruption that immediately began to spread through his system. The journey that followed was a nightmare of delirium and half-conscious suffering, with Yerga serving as both driver and nurse for a patient whose condition grew worse with each passing hour. The infection from the ghoul bite was unlike anything that normal medical treatment could address, requiring remedies that existed only in the specialized knowledge of those who understood supernatural physiology. But such expertise was scarce in a world where most healers dealt only with conventional injuries and diseases. In his fevered state, Geralt found himself reliving memories that he had spent decades trying to forget or suppress. The mother who had abandoned him to the witches appeared in visions that were both comforting and accusatory, offering explanations for choices that had shaped his entire life, while also confronting him with the pain that those choices had caused. Visenna's presence in his delirium was more real than the physical world around him, and her words carried the weight of truth even when they came from his own subconscious rather than external reality. The revelations that emerged from these fevered dreams provided answers to questions that Geralt had carried since childhood, explanations for why he had been given to the witches and what his mother had hoped to accomplish through such a devastating sacrifice. But the knowledge came at a time when he was too weak to process its implications, too close to death to make use of the understanding that might have changed how he saw his own purpose and worth. The arrival at Yerga's home marked both the end of one phase of the journey and the beginning of another that would prove even more significant. The merchant's wife greeted their approach with news of a young woman who had appeared in the nearby forest, a refugee from the war whose description matched someone that Geralt had been seeking without hope of success. The coincidence was too perfect to be mere chance, too precisely timed to be anything other than the hand of destiny finally revealing its design. The meeting in the forest was everything that 12 years of anticipation and dread had prepared him for, and nothing like what he had expected. Ciri ran to him with the instinctive recognition that connected souls across all barriers of time and circumstance, her embrace carrying the weight of prophecies fulfilled and obligations finally accepted. In that moment, Geralt understood that his long flight from responsibility was over, that the role he had tried to deny was now his whether he felt worthy of it or not. The words that passed between them were few but carried immense significance, acknowledgements of connection that transcended the merely familial to touch something deeper and more fundamental. When Ciri asked about Yennefer, when she spoke the sorceress's name with the casual familiarity of someone who had seen her in dreams or visions, Geralt understood that the threads connecting all their lives were more complex and far-reaching than he had ever imagined. The child of surprise had become his destiny at last, but she was not the burden he had feared or the simple obligation that others had described. She was a person in her own right, someone whose strength and intelligence had already been tested by circumstances that would have broken weaker spirits. The responsibility he now carried was not to control or direct her future, but to provide the guidance and protection that would allow her to discover her own path through the dangers that lay ahead. As they walked together away from the forest where destiny had finally claimed them both, Geralt carried with him the understanding that his life had entered a new phase that would be defined not by solitary wandering but by the bonds of family that he had never expected to experience. The path stretched ahead of them as it always had, but it was no longer a road he would travel alone. The White Wolf had found his pack at last, and with it had discovered purposes and possibilities that no amount of training or experience had prepared him to understand. The war that raged around them was far from over, and the forces that sought to use or destroy Ciri for their own purposes were only beginning to reveal themselves. But for the first time since leaving Kaer Morhen as a young man, Geralt was no longer running from destiny, but walking toward it with someone who shared both the burdens and the hopes that the future would bring. The Witcher, who had believed himself incapable of love, had found a daughter, and in finding her had discovered that the heart he thought the mutations had destroyed was still beating strong beneath his armored exterior. The months that followed Geralt and Ciri's reunion in the forest were a time of beria, learning and adjustment that tested both father and daughter in ways that neither had anticipated. The bond forged by destiny was real and undeniable, but translating that mystical connection into the practical realities of daily life proved more challenging than either prophecy or wishful thinking had suggested. Ciri had spent her entire life as a princess, accustomed to servants and luxury, while Geralt had lived for decades as a solitary wanderer whose only companions were his horse and the occasional bard or sorceress who chose to share his path for a while. The journey to Kaer Morhen took them through landscapes still scarred by war, where the evidence of Nilfgaard's advance remained visible in burned villages and abandoned farmsteads. But the mountain paths that led to the Witcher stronghold were untouched by human conflict, preserved in their ancient wildness by isolation and the reputation of the men who lived in the fortress above. For Ciri, who had never travelled beyond the borders of her grandmother's kingdom, the sight of those towering peaks and treacherous passes was both intimidating and exhilarating. The fortress itself, when it finally came into view, was nothing like the fairy tale castle she had grown up in. Kaer Morhen was a place built for function rather than beauty, its massive walls and defensive towers speaking of an age when witches had been numerous enough to require such elaborate headquarters. Now it seemed almost empty, its vast halls and training grounds echoing with memories of the hundreds of men who had once called it home. Vesemir's reaction to their arrival was a mixture of joy and concern that reflected the complex emotions surrounding Ciri's presence in their sanctuary. The oldest of the remaining witches was genuinely happy to see Geralt return with the child he had spent so many years denying, but he also understood better than anyone the challenges that lay ahead. Training a normal boy to become a witcher was difficult enough. Preparing a young woman whose blood carried powers that none of them fully understood would require methods and techniques that had never been attempted before. The other witches who had gathered at Kaer Morhen for the winter months represented the last remnants of the School of the Wolf, each carrying his own history of trials survived and brothers lost. Lambert's skepticism about bringing an outsider into their midst was balanced by Eskel's quiet acceptance and Cohen's scholarly curiosity about the magical abilities that Ciri was beginning to manifest. Together, they formed a family of sorts, bound not by blood, but by shared experiences and mutual understanding of what it meant to be different from the rest of humanity. Ciri's introduction to Witcher training began with the basic physical conditioning that formed the foundation of their combat techniques. The obstacle courses that had challenged generations of young men proved even more difficult for someone whose body had not been enhanced by mutations. But her determination and natural athleticism allowed her to make progress that impressed even her harshest critics. The wooden swords and practice dummies that had seemed like toys in Sintra's comfortable armories became instruments of genuine education in the art of staying alive. But it was the discovery of Eskel's condition that brought the first real crisis to their winter sanctuary. The infection that had claimed one of Geralt's oldest friends was unlike anything they had encountered before, a supernatural corruption that transformed him into something that was no longer entirely human. The Leshy that he became retained enough of his original personality to make the situation heartbreaking, but his increasing aggression and loss of control made him too dangerous to allow him to remain among them. The decision to end Eskel's suffering fell to Geralt, as such decisions always did in their small community. The man who had been his brother in all but blood, who had shared the trials and transformations that had made them both into weapons against the darkness, deserved better than to be consumed by forces beyond his control. The silver sword that opened his heart was both mercy and necessity, a final gift from someone who understood what it meant to lose yourself to powers that offered strength at the cost of everything that made life worth living. The investigation that followed Eskel's death led them to disturbing discoveries about the nature of the creatures that had begun appearing in the forests around their stronghold, the monoliths that dotted the landscape, ancient structures that most people dismissed as curious relics from some forgotten civilization, were revealing themselves to be conduits for forces that threatened to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. The stellarcite that contaminated both the Leshy and the creatures that killed it spoke of connections to powers that existed outside the normal boundaries of their world. Triss Merigold's arrival at Kaer Morhen was both welcome and troubling, bringing with her the expertise in magical theory that they desperately needed, while also raising questions about the true nature of Ciri's abilities. The sorceress who had once served kings and fought in their wars had evolved into something more complex, a scholar whose understanding of magical forces went far beyond the practical applications that most of her peers focused on. Her willingness to help train Ciri came with warnings about the dangers they were all facing. The tests that Triss conducted revealed the extent to which Ciri's powers differed from normal magical abilities. Where most sorcerers learned to channel chaos through careful study and disciplined practice, Ciri's connection to supernatural forces seemed to operate according to different rules entirely. The elder blood that flowed through her veins carried abilities that predated human understanding of magic, powers that had been ancient when the conjunction of the spheres first brought different worlds together. The expedition to examine the monolith outside Sintra provided concrete evidence of the threats they were facing, while also revealing the scope of Ciri's untrained abilities. The structure that had stood innocuously in the landscape for centuries was now active in ways that defied conventional understanding, serving as a gateway for creatures that had no business existing in their reality. The portal that opened when Ciri's scream toppled the stone revealed glimpses of other worlds, other possibilities that existed parallel to their own. But it was the appearance of Yennefer that truly complicated the situation at Kaer Morhen, bringing with her a history of love and loss that neither Geralt nor Ciri was fully prepared to handle. The sorceress who had once been the most important person in Geralt's life arrived broken and desperate, her magical abilities stripped away by forces that had left her feeling hollow and purposeless. The woman who had defined herself through power and control was now dependent on others for protection and support. The reunion between Geralt and Yennefer was everything that years of separation and unresolved conflict had made. Inevitable, a mixture of joy and pain that reflected both the depth of their connection and the magnitude of their differences. The love that had survived magical compulsion and bitter arguments was still there, but it was complicated now by the presence of Ciri and the responsibilities that came with protecting someone whose importance to the world's future was becoming increasingly clear. Yennefer's relationship with Ciri began as a matter of necessity, but gradually evolved into something deeper and more meaningful than either had expected. The sorceress who had spent decades longing for a child of her own found in Ciri a daughter figure who needed guidance and protection that only someone with magical knowledge could provide. The princess who had lost her grandmother and her kingdom discovered in Yennefer a maternal presence who understood both the burdens and the possibilities that came with supernatural power. The training sessions that followed were unlike anything that had ever been attempted at Kaer Morhen, combining traditional Witcher techniques with magical instruction that pushed the boundaries of what any of them understood about Ciri's abilities. The power that she carried within her was vast but uncontrolled, capable of magnificent achievement or catastrophic destruction depending on the circumstances that triggered its release. Learning to harness that power would require patience, understanding, and techniques that would have to be developed through experimentation and trial. But the forces that sought to claim or destroy Ciri were not content to wait while she learned to control her abilities. The Deathless Mother, known to scholars as Voleth Mer, had been imprisoned for centuries by the first Witchers who recognized the threat she represented to all life in their world. Her connection to the monoliths and the creatures that emerged from them was part of a larger plan to escape her prison and return to the sphere of existence where she belonged, regardless of the cost to everyone else. The demon's manipulation of Yennefer was both subtle and devastating, playing on the sorceress's deepest insecurities and desperate desire to regain the magical abilities that had defined her identity. The bargain that Voleth Mer offered seemed reasonable on the surface, a simple exchange of services that would restore Yennefer's power in return for bringing Ciri to a place where the demon could claim her. But the true cost of such agreements was always higher than the desperate were prepared to pay. The possession of Ciri that followed was a violation that went beyond the merely physical to attack the very essence of who she was as a bad person. The Deathless Mother's presence within her body was like a cancer that consumed everything it touched, using her power and her connections to others as weapons against everyone she cared about. The sight of someone so young and vital being used as a vessel for such ancient malevolence was almost more than the Witchers could bear to witness. The battle that erupted within Kaer Morhen's halls was unlike any that the fortress had ever seen, a conflict that combined conventional weapons with magical forces that threatened to tear the very building apart. The basilisks that poured through the portal opened by Voleth Mer were creatures of nightmare made manifest, their presence transforming the familiar corridors and training rooms into an alien battlefield where survival required tactics that no amount of preparation could have provided. Vesemir's sacrifice in attempting to save Ciri was the action of a man who had spent his entire life protecting others, even when the cost to himself was higher than anyone should be asked to pay. The oldest of the Witchers had seen too many of his students and colleagues die to allow another young person to be consumed by forces beyond their control. His willingness to use the mutagens that might have transformed Ciri into something more capable of defending herself was born from desperation rather than wisdom. But his intentions were pure, even if his methods were questionable. Geralt's intervention to prevent that final transformation was motivated by understanding that went beyond mere protectiveness to touch on fundamental questions about identity and choice. The mutations that had made him into an effective monster hunter had also cut him off from much of what made life worth living, and the idea of imposing such changes on someone he had come to love as a daughter was unthinkable. Better to face the dangers ahead as they were than to sacrifice Ciri's humanity for the sake of enhanced combat abilities. The final confrontation with Voleth Mare required tactics that none of them had been trained for, a battle that was as much about understanding and acceptance as it was about raw power. The demon's true desire was not conquest or destruction, but simply the freedom to return to her own sphere of existence, to escape the prison that had held her for centuries and find her way back to the dimension where she belonged. Her methods were ruthless, and her willingness to sacrifice others was unforgivable. But her ultimate goal was comprehensible to anyone who had ever felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Yennefer's sacrifice to free Ciri from the demon's possession was the redemption that her manipulation and betrayal had made necessary, proof that love could overcome even the most desperate mistakes. The ritual that transferred Voleth Mare from Ciri to herself was both magical working and act of maternal devotion, a demonstration that the bonds between them had grown stronger than fear or self-preservation. The pain that followed was the price that had to be paid for choices made in desperation and despair. The portal that opened to allow the deathless mother's return to her home dimension was a gateway between worlds that revealed the true scope of the forces they had been dealing with. The wild hunt that appeared to claim Voleth Mare was not the enemy that legends had painted them as, but fellow travelers seeking to restore the natural order that her imprisonment had disrupted. Their presence was both terrifying and magnificent, a reminder that the universe contained powers and purposes that transcended human understanding. The restoration of Yennefer's magical abilities that followed was more than just the return of lost power. It was a fundamental healing that went to the core of who she was as a person. The sacrifice she had made for Ciri had proven worthy of the gifts that had been taken from her, and the magic that flowed back into her consciousness was stronger and more refined than what she had lost. The sorceress who emerged from the experience was someone who had been tested by the ultimate trial and found worthy of the power she wielded. The family that came together in the aftermath of the crisis was unlike anything that any of places them had expected to find. Geralt, who had believed himself incapable of normal relationships, discovered that love could take forms that had nothing to do with romance or physical attraction. Yennefer, who had spent decades searching for the child she could never bear, found in Ciri a daughter whose need for guidance and protection fulfilled the maternal instincts that magic had not been able to satisfy. And Ciri, who had lost everything she thought defined her identity, learned that family could be chosen rather than inherited, that the bonds of affection and mutual support were stronger than those of blood or political alliance. The understanding that connected them all was deeper than mere affection, rooted in shared experiences and mutual recognition of each other's essential worth. They had faced destruction together and emerged stronger for the experience, their individual strengths combining to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The destiny that had brought them together was no longer an external force imposing its will upon them, but an internal recognition of the connections that made life meaningful and worth defending. The challenges that lay ahead were no less daunting than those they had already faced, but they would meet them as a unit rather than as individuals struggling alone against forces beyond their control. Ciri's powers were growing stronger and more controlled with each passing day, but so too were the threats that sought to exploit or eliminate her. The wild hunt might have respected their victory over the deathless mother, but there were other forces in the world that would not be so easily deterred from their goals. The path forward would require all of their combined skills and wisdom, Witcher training and magical knowledge working together to protect someone whose importance to the world's future was becoming increasingly clear. But for the first time since the chaos had begun, they faced that uncertain future with hope rather than despair, confident that whatever challenges awaited them could be overcome through courage, determination, and the unbreakable bonds that had been forged in the crucible of shared adversity. The White Wolf was no longer alone on his path, and the family he had never expected to find had become the foundation for everything that would follow. The Witcher, who had once believed that he was incapable of love, had learned that the heart he thought his mutations had destroyed was not only intact but strong enough to embrace connections that would sustain him through whatever trials lay ahead. In finding his child of surprise, he had discovered not just a destiny, but a purpose that gave meaning to all the years of struggle and solitude that had preceded this moment of recognition and acceptance. And so we reach the end of our long journey through the life of Geralt of Rivia, the White Wolf whose path led him from the harsh trials of Kaer Morhen to the discovery of a family he never expected to find. In following his story, we have witnessed the transformation of a man who believed himself incapable of love into someone who understood that the heart survives even the most brutal mutations, that connection and meaning can flourish even in the harshest circumstances. The Witcher who began his tale as a solitary figure, marked by tragedy and defined by the violence necessary to survive in a world that feared what it needed, discovered that destiny was not the cruel master he had taken it for, but rather a force that could lead to redemption and purpose when embraced with courage and wisdom. Through Renfri's prophecy and Pavetta's wedding, through the trials of love found and lost with Yennefer, and finally through the bond forged with Ciri, Geralt learned that the mutations that had made him different from other men had not destroyed his capacity for the connections that make existence meaningful. The themes that have woven through his story speak to truths that transcend the boundaries between our world and his. The question of whether we can choose our own paths or must accept what fate has written for us finds its answer not in absolute freedom or complete predetermination, but in the recognition that destiny and choice work together in ways that serve purposes greater than individual desire. Geralt's long resistance to his child of surprise taught him that running from responsibility often leads us exactly where we need to be, that the obligations we fear most may prove to be the gifts we needed most desperately. His relationship with Yennefer showed us that love is not always comfortable or convenient, that the deepest connections can survive misunderstanding and separation because they are built on recognition of essential worth rather than mere attraction or compatibility. Their bond, forged in magic but sustained by genuine understanding, demonstrated that even wishes made in desperation can lead to authentic feeling when the hearts involved are capable of growth and forgiveness. Through Ciri, Geralt discovered that fatherhood need not be biological to be real, that the choice to protect and guide another person can create bonds stronger than blood. The princess who became his daughter taught him that strength comes not from mutation or magic alone, but from the willingness to stand with others against the darkness that would consume everything we hold dear. The family they formed together, Witcher and sorceress and princess bound by love rather than law, represents hope that extends far beyond their individual circumstances. In a world torn by war and threatened by forces that seek to exploit or destroy anything different from themselves, they stand as proof that understanding can bridge any gap, that acceptance can overcome fear, and that the courage to care for others is the most powerful magic of all. As you drift towards sleep, let yourself rest in the knowledge that even in the darkest times, even when the path ahead seems impossible to navigate, the connections we make with others provide both strength and direction. The White Wolf's journey reminds us that no one is beyond redemption, that no heart is too damaged to heal, and that the family we choose is often more precious than the one we inherit. Rest now, and dream not of monsters in the darkness, but of the light that brave souls carry with them wherever they go. Dream of love that survives every trial, of courage that faces down impossible odds, and of the hope that tomorrow will bring new chances to protect what matters most. The path continues for all of us, winding through landscapes we cannot yet imagine toward destinations we have not yet dreamed. But like Geralt, we do not walk it alone, and in that companionship lies all the strength we need to face whatever challenges await. Sleep well, knowing that every ending is also a beginning, and that the stories that matter most are the ones where love triumphs over fear, where understanding conquers hatred, and where the choice to care for others transforms even the most unlikely heroes into legends worthy of remembrance. The White Wolf's tale is complete, but the hope it carries lives on in every heart that refuses to surrender to despair.